The night did not arrive with thunder. It came quietly, slipping through the narrow streets of Paris like a held breath. October 13th, 1307. A Friday. The city was asleep, unaware that by morning, one of the most powerful orders in Christian history would be shattered beyond repair. Torches appeared first, flickers of orange light cutting through mist and shadow. They moved with purpose, not the chaotic rush of a riot, but the disciplined stride of men who knew exactly where they were going. Iron boots struck stone in unison. Seals bearing the authority of the French crown were clutched in gloved hands. Orders had already been written, names already listed, guilt already assumed. Inside the temple complex of Paris, the Knights Templar slept as they had for decades. Men bound by vows of poverty, obedience, and faith. These were not rebels hiding in the dark. They were warriors of Christ, defenders of pilgrims, bankers of kings, and servants of the church itself. They had fought and bled for the cross. They had prayed beneath its symbol every dawn and dusk. And yet, on this night, the cross would offer no protection. Doors were forced open. Chains rattled. Voices shouted accusations that made no sense in the half-light of sleep. Knights were pulled from their beds, some still clutching prayer beads, others reaching instinctively for swords that were no longer theirs to wield. Confusion spread first, then fear, then something deeper and more unsettling, a realization that this was not a misunderstanding. Across France, the same scene unfolded simultaneously. Hundreds of Templars arrested at once, with impossible coordination. No warning, no chance to flee, no opportunity to appeal to Rome. It was as if the world they had known simply vanished between one breath and the next. By sunrise, the narrative was already fixed. The Knights Templar were no longer holy warriors. They were heretics, idol worshippers, blasphemers who spat on the cross, denied Christ, and bowed before a shadowy figure whispered about only in terror, Baphomet. The accusations were as shocking as they were sudden. And to those who knew the order from within, they were utterly incomprehensible. How could men who had built chapels, protected churches, and died for the faith be guilty of such crimes? How could an order endorsed by popes, celebrated in sermons, and trusted with the wealth of Europe be exposed overnight as an enemy of God? The answer officially was simple. The church had uncovered the truth. But history is rarely that simple. As the arrested knights were dragged through streets now filling with whispers, a deeper silence settled over Europe. The kind of silence that follows a door being sealed, a record being closed, a question being forbidden. Because what was happening was not merely an arrest. It was an erasure. The Templars had existed for nearly 2 centuries. They had risen from obscurity to become one of the most powerful institutions in medieval Christendom. They answered to no king, paid no taxes, held land, castles, fleets, and vaults of unimaginable wealth. And yet, their true power was not military or financial. It was something less visible, something far more dangerous. As interrogations began, the tone shifted quickly from investigation to punishment. Confessions were demanded before questions were answered. Pain became proof. Silence became guilt. Men who had survived the deserts of the Holy Land and the swords of Muslim armies now faced a different kind of enemy, one that wore familiar symbols and spoke in the language of salvation. Under torture, words broke loose. Some repeated accusations they barely understood. Others resisted until their bodies failed them. And these broken testimonies would become the foundation of official history. But even then, cracks appeared. Some knights recanted the moment the pain stopped. Others contradicted one another entirely. The supposed heresies varied wildly depending on who was speaking and how much suffering had preceded their words. It was not truth being extracted. It was something being constructed. And yet, the machine continued. Because this night was not born of sudden revelation. It was the final move in a game that had been unfolding quietly for years. A game involving debt, power, fear, and a church that no longer controlled the very order it had created. King Philip IV of France was drowning in debt, much of it owed to the Templars themselves. The French crown had borrowed heavily from the order, trusting its vast financial network. But debts have a way of changing relationships. What begins as trust often ends as resentment. And resentment, when mixed with ambition, becomes dangerous. The Church, too, was uneasy. The Templars answered directly to the Pope, bypassing local bishops and kings. Their wealth rivaled that of monarchs. Their secrecy bred suspicion, and their long presence in the East had exposed them to ideas, cultures, and knowledge far beyond the rigid doctrines of Western Christendom. They had seen the world differently, and perhaps they had begun to understand faith differently as well. That possibility alone was enough to make powerful men nervous. So the night arrived quietly, not with chaos but with paperwork, not with questions but with certainty, a coordinated strike designed not to correct, but to eliminate. And as dawn broke over Paris, something else became clear. This was not just the fall of an order. It was a warning. It said that faith could be redefined by authority, that history could be rewritten by those who survived it, and that devotion, no matter how sincere, offered no protection when it collided with power. The Church would claim it had acted to defend Christianity. The Crown would claim justice had been served. But beneath those claims lay an unspoken truth. Whatever the Templars truly possessed, whatever they truly knew, had become too dangerous to exist in the open. And so it was buried. Not just the men, but their story. Yet history has a way of resisting silence. Even when records are burned and voices extinguished, echoes remain. In sealed archives, in half-forgotten symbols, in questions that refuse to disappear. Because if the Knights Templar were destroyed for heresy, why does their story feel unfinished? And if this night was meant to erase a secret forever, why are we still searching for it, more than 700 years later? Long before torches cut through the Parisian night, before accusations of heresy and whispered confessions, there was a promise made in dust and sunlight. To understand the fall of the Knights Templar, one must first return to their beginning, not to power or wealth, but to fear, devotion, and a fragile hope struggling to survive in a violent world. Jerusalem in the early 12th century was a city of scars. The First Crusade had torn it from Muslim control in 1099, leaving behind blood-soaked streets and a Christian kingdom surrounded by enemies. Pilgrims from across Europe poured into the Holy Land, drawn by faith and the promise of salvation. Many never made it home. Roads were dangerous. Bandits waited in mountain passes. Small groups of travelers vanished without trace. Prayer alone offered little protection against steel. It was in this fragile, uncertain landscape that a small group of knights stepped forward. They were not great lords or celebrated heroes. They had no banners recognized across Europe. Around the year 1119, a French knight named Hugues de Payens, along with a handful of companions, approached the newly established Christian authorities in Jerusalem with an unusual proposal. They would renounce personal wealth. They would live as monks, and they would dedicate their lives to protecting pilgrims on the road. The idea was radical. Knights were trained to fight, to claim land, to win glory. Monks were sworn to prayer, silence, and withdrawal from the world. To combine the two was almost unthinkable. And yet, the need was undeniable. The Holy Land required defenders who could fight without looting, without ambition, without distraction. Men who would see violence not as conquest, but as duty. The King of Jerusalem granted them quarters in a wing of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, built atop what was believed to be the ruins of Solomon's Temple. From this location came their name, the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, the Knights Templar. At first, they were barely noticed. Chroniclers mention them only in passing. They wore simple habits. Their armor was mismatched and worn. According to tradition, two knights shared a single horse, a symbol of their poverty that would later appear on their seal. They took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, binding themselves not to a kingdom, but to a spiritual ideal. For nearly a decade, the order existed in this quiet state, underfunded, undermanned, and largely unsupported. Their mission was dangerous and often fatal. Many died protecting travelers whose names were never recorded. There were no triumphal songs written for them, no great victories celebrated in courts. Only long roads, endless dust, and the constant threat of ambush. What changed their fate was not battle, but belief. In 1129, the Council of Troyes convened in France. There, the Templars received official recognition from the Church, largely through the support of Bernard of Clairvaux, one of the most influential religious figures of the age. Bernard was not a warrior. He was a mystic, a reformer, and a man deeply concerned with the moral decay he perceived within Christendom. To him, the Templars represented something pure, a fusion of faith and discipline that could restore meaning to both monastic life and warfare. In his treatise praising the new order, Bernard described the Templars as a new kind of soldier, one who fought not for personal gain but for divine justice. Killing in battle, he argued, was not murder if done in defense of the faithful. This theological justification was revolutionary. It sanctified violence under specific conditions and gave the Church a tool unlike any it had possessed before. With papal approval came transformation. Donations flowed in from across Europe. Land, money, horses, weapons. Noble families sent younger sons to join the order, believing it to be a path to salvation. Commanderies were established from England to the Holy Roman Empire. What had begun as a small brotherhood on the edge of survival became an international institution almost overnight. Yet even as their power grew, the Templars clung to the image of humility. Their rule emphasized discipline, silence, and obedience. They ate simple food. They slept in armor. They prayed collectively, often standing shoulder to shoulder, weapons nearby. Individual identity dissolved into brotherhood. A knight was no longer a man with a past, but a servant of a mission. This strict internal culture forged an intense loyalty. Brothers trusted one another with their lives, their confessions, their fears. Secrets were shared not lightly, but deeply, within a structure that valued unity above all else. What was spoken inside the order stayed there. The Church saw in the Templars the embodiment of its ideals. Kings saw a reliable military force. Pilgrims saw protectors. But beneath these outward roles, something else was forming. The Templars were becoming a community apart, connected across borders, fluent in multiple cultures, and shaped by years of direct contact with the Islamic world. In the Holy Land, the lines between enemy and neighbor were not always clear. Trade occurred. Knowledge passed quietly from one side to another. Muslim scholars preserved ancient Greek texts long lost in Europe. Jewish mystics debated the nature of God, creation, and divine law. The Templars, stationed at crossroads of civilization, witnessed this exchange firsthand. Exposure changes people. The knights who returned to Europe were not the same men who had left. They had seen advanced mathematics, medicine, and architecture. They had encountered forms of faith that challenged rigid assumptions. None of this was necessarily heretical, but it was unfamiliar. And unfamiliarity has always unsettled institutions built on certainty. Still, in these early years, the promise held. The Templars believed they were serving God. The Church believed it was guiding them. The relationship was mutually reinforcing, bound by shared purpose. But within that promise lay the seed of future conflict. The order was designed to operate independently, answering directly to the Pope. This freedom allowed it to function efficiently across borders, but it also placed the Templars outside traditional chains of authority. Bishops could not command them. Kings could not tax them. Over time, this autonomy would become a source of resentment and fear. Yet none of that was visible at the beginning. In those early days, the Templars were still men of faith walking dangerous roads, protecting strangers because they believed it was right. They prayed not for power, but for endurance. They did not imagine that their obedience would one day be used against them, or that their devotion would be recast as deception. They could not have known that the promise they made, to serve God without question, would one day leave them defenseless when the questions stopped being asked. Because when an institution creates something it cannot fully control, admiration can turn to suspicion. And suspicion, when left to grow in silence, eventually demands a reckoning. The rise of the Knights Templar did not begin with secrets. It began with trust. And that, perhaps more than anything else, is what made their eventual fall so devastating. Once the Church had given its blessing, the transformation of the Knights Templar was swift and unmistakable. What had begun as a fragile brotherhood guarding pilgrims along dusty roads was reshaped into something far more formidable, a force forged not merely for defense, but for influence. The Church had not simply recognized the Templars. It had weaponized them. Papal approval carried with it extraordinary privileges. The Templars were granted exemption from local laws and taxes. They answered directly to the Pope himself, bypassing bishops, archbishops, and kings alike. Their churches could collect tithes. Their lands were protected from interference. Their movements were unhindered by borders that restricted others. In a fragmented medieval world, this made them uniquely powerful. To the Church, this was not recklessness. It was strategy. Christendom in the 12th century was under constant pressure. The Holy Land remained unstable. Rival Christian kingdoms warred among themselves. Secular rulers challenged ecclesiastical authority with growing confidence. The papacy needed an instrument that could act swiftly, loyally, and without the complications of feudal politics. The Templars became that instrument. They were warriors bound not by bloodline, but by belief. Their loyalty was vertical, not horizontal, directed upward toward Rome, rather than outward toward family or homeland. In an era when most power was inherited, this made them unusually dependable. They could be trusted to act in the name of the Church without hesitation. And act they did. Templar commanderies multiplied across Europe and the Levant. Each one functioned as a self-contained node within a vast network, connected by shared rules, symbols, and discipline. Messages could travel quickly through these channels, carried by brothers who recognized one another instantly. This quiet efficiency made the order indispensable in times of crisis. On the battlefield, the Templars earned a reputation that bordered on fearsome. They charged when others retreated. They held formations under impossible pressure. Their rule forbade retreat unless ordered, even if it meant death. Muslim chroniclers wrote of their relentlessness with both respect and dread. To face the Templars was to face men who did not fear dying. Yet their strength was not only physical. It was psychological. The image of warrior monks, men who combined religious devotion with martial discipline, captured the medieval imagination. They embodied the idea that God actively intervened in human affairs, fighting alongside his chosen servants. Their presence on a battlefield was seen as a sign of divine favor. When they lost, the loss was often explained not as weakness, but as mysterious providence. This aura elevated them above ordinary soldiers. It also insulated them from criticism. But as the order grew, so did its distance from the people it served. The Templars lived by their own rules, in their own fortified houses, governed by internal law. They were respected but also watched. Admiration has always walked closely beside unease. The Church, meanwhile, relied increasingly on the order's capabilities. The Templars guarded important routes, stored valuable relics, and protected high-ranking clerics. Their wealth funded crusades. Their castles anchored Christian territory in hostile lands. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the Church's reliance became dependence. And dependence changes power dynamics. While the Templars were bound by obedience, they were also protected by privilege. Papal bulls reinforced their autonomy again and again, often in response to complaints from local authorities. Bishops protested that Templars collected tithes without oversight. Nobles resented lands that could not be taxed or reclaimed. Kings bristled at an armed force operating within their borders beyond their command. Each complaint was addressed individually. Each resentment was postponed, not resolved. Within the order, identity hardened. A Templar was not simply a Christian knight. He was part of something purer, stricter, and more demanding. This belief fostered pride, even if the rule cautioned against it. Brothers spoke a shared language of sacrifice and purpose that outsiders could not fully penetrate. That separation, once a source of strength, began to isolate them. In the Holy Land, the Templars negotiated truces, exchanged prisoners, and occasionally acted independently of Crusader kings. Their long presence gave them institutional memory others lacked. They knew the terrain. They understood their enemies. Sometimes this meant choosing pragmatism over fanaticism, a choice that unsettled more rigid voices within the church. To survive, the Templars had learned flexibility. To the church, flexibility sometimes looked like deviation. Still, outward harmony remained. The order continued to receive support. New recruits arrived. Donations increased. But beneath the surface, an imbalance was forming. The church had created a force powerful enough to shape events, but not fully obedient in spirit. The Templars followed the letter of papal command, yet their lived reality set them apart. They were becoming indispensable, and that is often the most dangerous position of all. History shows that institutions tolerate power they can control. They fear power they cannot. The Templars were drifting from one category into the other. Their independence was once justified by necessity. Over time, it began to feel like defiance. Their secrecy, once practical, now appeared suspicious. Their wealth, once a means to an end, now seemed excessive for men sworn to poverty. And yet, from within the order, little appeared amiss. The brothers believed they were fulfilling their sacred role exactly as intended. They prayed. They trained. They obeyed. They could not see how their very success was reshaping how others perceived them. The church had forged its perfect weapon, disciplined, mobile, and devoted. But it had also unleashed a force that operated across borders, cultures, and systems of authority. A force that learned, adapted, and remembered. And when the world began to change, when crusades faltered, when kings grew stronger, when faith itself became a battlefield, the existence of such a force raised an unspoken question. What happens when the weapon outlives the war it was created to fight? The answer would not come immediately. It would arrive slowly, through suspicion, rumor, and fear. But the seeds were already planted. The same privileges that elevated the Templars would one day isolate them. The same obedience that defined them would leave them vulnerable. Because when the church created the Knights Templar, it believed it had shaped a servant. It did not yet realize it had also created a mirror, one that reflected uncomfortable truths about power, faith, and control. And mirrors, when they reveal too much, are often shattered. As the centuries turned and the crusading world settled into uneasy routine, the Knights Templar began to change in ways few had anticipated. Their swords were still sharp, their vows still spoken, but another form of power was quietly taking shape. One that did not rely on steel or fortresses, but on trust. And trust, once established, can move more than armies ever could. Pilgrims, nobles, merchants, and even kings faced a simple problem in the medieval world. Money was heavy, dangerous to carry, and easy to steal. A journey from Paris to Jerusalem could take months and pass through lands ruled by rivals or bandits. To travel with gold was to invite disaster. The Templars, with their network of fortified houses stretching across Europe and the Holy Land, offered an elegant solution. A traveler could deposit funds at a Templar commandery in one city and receive a coded document. At another commandery hundreds of miles away, that document could be exchanged for the same value. No coins were carried. No thieves tempted. It was not called banking yet, but in practice that is exactly what it was. What made this system work was not innovation alone, but reputation. The Templars were known for discipline and order. They were bound by vows that suggested incorruptibility. They were protected by the church and feared by enemies. People trusted them with their wealth because they trusted them with their lives. Soon, deposits grew larger. Nobles entrusted estates. Crusader kings left treasuries in Templar vaults. The French crown itself became deeply entangled with the order's financial services. The irony was striking. Men sworn to poverty were becoming the guardians of Europe's riches. Inside Templar commanderies, ledgers replaced battle plans. Account books were carefully maintained. Transactions recorded with precision uncommon for the era. This administrative sophistication set the order apart from both secular lords and ecclesiastical rivals. They were not merely warriors. They were managers of complex systems. And systems create power. Unlike feudal wealth, which was tied to land and lineage, Templar wealth was mobile. It flowed across borders, oceans, and political divisions. This gave the order resilience. When one region fell into turmoil, another could support it. Losses in the east could be offset by holdings in the west. No single king could strangle the order financially. To the Templars, this was simply good stewardship. To others, it looked like something else entirely. How could men who ate simple meals and wore plain habits control so much gold? How could an order dedicated to Christ possess resources rivaling monarchs? The contradiction unsettled observers. Poverty was visible. Wealth was hidden. And hidden wealth invites speculation. Rumors began to circulate. Some claimed the Templars hoarded treasure in secret vaults. Others whispered of ancient riches discovered beneath the Temple Mount. Stories grew with each telling, blurring the line between reality and imagination. The truth that the order functioned as a financial network was too abstract for many to grasp. Mystery filled the gap. As their financial role expanded, so did their political entanglements. Lending to kings is never neutral. It creates obligation, but also resentment. When a ruler borrows beyond his means, the creditor becomes a reminder of failure. Over time, debts owed to the Templars became symbols of humiliation rather than gratitude. King Philip IV of France felt this keenly. His wars and ambitions drained the royal treasury. The Templars, once allies, became uncomfortable mirrors reflecting the crown's dependency. They were no longer just servants of the church. They were creditors to kings. This shift altered how the order was perceived. Knights in white mantles were no longer seen solely as holy warriors. They were bankers, administrators, and power brokers. Their neutrality, once admired, now appeared suspicious. Their independence, once praised, now felt threatening. Inside the order, however, little changed in daily life. The rule remained strict. Brothers continued to rise for prayer before dawn, to train, to eat in silence. Individual wealth was still forbidden. No Templar owned the gold he guarded. This internal consistency made the external accusations harder to understand. Yet perception often matters more than reality. The church itself benefited from the Templars' financial expertise. Funds for crusades flowed through their hands. Papal treasuries were safeguarded by them. But as the church's own authority came under pressure, from reform movements, from secular rulers, from internal corruption, the existence of an autonomous financial power within its structure became increasingly uncomfortable. The Templars were not corrupt in the conventional sense. There is little evidence of personal enrichment or decadence. But they represented something new. An institution that combined spiritual legitimacy with economic intelligence. This combination challenged the traditional hierarchy in subtle but profound ways. In medieval thought, money was morally dangerous. Tempted greed, distorted virtue, and threatened spiritual purity. The church often preached against usury, even as it quietly relied on financial systems to function. The Templars embodied this contradiction. They did not charge interest in the usual sense, yet their services generated influence. They navigated moral boundaries others refused to acknowledge. Their ability to operate in this gray space made them invaluable and deeply unsettling. As time passed, the order's military relevance began to wane. Crusader states fell one by one. The dream of a permanently Christian Holy Land faded. But the Templars remained, their wealth and network intact. The original justification for their existence weakened, even as their institutional strength endured. This imbalance raised an unspoken question among rulers and clerics alike. Why did the order still need so much power? Without constant warfare to legitimize their role, the Templars' wealth stood exposed. What had once funded holy war now appeared excessive. Their castles in Europe, far from any battlefield, looked less like defenses and more like fortresses of privilege. Resentment simmered. Common people whispered about secret riches. Nobles complained of unfair competition. Clergy questioned the morality of an order that seemed to straddle sacred and secular worlds with ease. None of these concerns amounted to accusation yet, but they formed a background noise, a low hum of doubt that never quite faded. And doubt, once established, waits patiently for a moment to act. The Templars did not see themselves as powerful in the way others did. They saw responsibility, not dominance. They believed their wealth served a higher purpose. But power, even when unintended, reshapes relationships. Those who possess it rarely notice the fear it inspires in others. By becoming Europe's most trusted guardians of wealth, the Templars had crossed an invisible line. They were no longer just warriors of God. They were custodians of something deeply human, security. And whoever controls security inevitably invites scrutiny, envy, and eventually challenge. What began as a solution to a practical problem had transformed the Order's destiny. The same trust that elevated them would one day be turned against them. And when that day came, the gold they safeguarded would not save them. Because in a world where faith and power collide, wealth is never just wealth. It is a story others tell about you. And the story forming around the Knights Templar was growing darker with every passing year. When the first Knights Templar settled into their quarters in Jerusalem, they did not choose their home at random. They were given a portion of the former Al-Aqsa Mosque, a vast stone structure standing atop one of the most sacred pieces of land on earth. To Christians, it was the site of Solomon's temple. To Jews, the holiest place of their faith. To Muslims, the noble sanctuary. Layers of devotion, conflict, and memory pressed into the stone beneath their feet. Officially, the Templars were stationed there for practical reasons. The building offered space, defensibility, and proximity to key routes. Yet from the beginning, questions followed them. Because living above the ruins of Solomon's temple was not merely symbolic. It was extraordinary. No other order had been granted such a location. And for men who valued secrecy and discipline, the choice carried implications that would echo for centuries. The chronicles of the time say little about what happened beneath the Temple Mount. That silence is precisely what has fueled speculation ever since. According to later accounts, the Templars spent years excavating beneath their headquarters. They claimed to be strengthening foundations, digging cisterns, and reinforcing defenses. In a city where water was scarce and siege was constant, such work made sense. But the scale of the digging, and the duration of it, raised eyebrows even among their contemporaries. Local residents noticed soil being removed. Tunnels were rumored to stretch in multiple directions. Access was restricted. No outsiders were permitted to observe the work closely. And when questions were asked, answers were vague. What made this secrecy more striking was the nature of the site itself. Solomon's temple was not just an ancient building. It was a place of legend. According to biblical tradition, it once housed the Ark of the Covenant, the chest said to contain the tablets of divine law, a direct physical link between God and humanity. It was also associated with sacred wisdom, royal authority, and the very presence of God on earth. To medieval Christians, these were not metaphors. They were tangible possibilities. If anything of Solomon's temple remained buried beneath Jerusalem, the implications would have been immense. Relics held power. Sacred objects could legitimize kings, sanctify wars, and reshape theology. The Church guarded such relics fiercely. And yet, here were the Templars, operating with remarkable autonomy at the heart of this sacred ground. No contemporary record confirms that they found anything extraordinary. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, especially when records themselves may have been selectively preserved. What we do know is that after their time on the Temple Mount, the character of the order began to change. The Templars returned to Europe not just with military experience, but with unusual confidence. Their symbols grew more complex. Their internal rituals, while still largely orthodox, became more elaborate and closed. This does not prove discovery, but it suggests influence. The East exposed the Templars to a world far older and more philosophically diverse than the feudal societies of Europe. Islamic scholars preserved works of Aristotle and Plato. Jewish thinkers explored mystical interpretations of Scripture. Ancient traditions survived there that had been forgotten or condemned in the West. To live for years atop the ruins of Solomon's temple was to exist at the intersection of all these traditions. Even if the Templars found nothing tangible, they were surrounded by stories, ideas, and questions that challenged simplistic understandings of faith. Some later legends claimed they uncovered ancient manuscripts. Others spoke of sacred geometry, coded knowledge, or relics of immense power. These stories flourish centuries after the fact, shaped by imagination and romanticism. Yet their persistence hints at something unresolved. Why did so many believe the Templars had discovered something worth killing them for? One reason lies in the order's unusual relationship with secrecy. Unlike monasteries, which often welcomed pilgrims and chroniclers, Templar commanderies were closed worlds. Initiation rituals were private. Discussions among brothers were not shared. This culture of silence was practical for a military order, but it also created fertile ground for rumor. When the Templars left Jerusalem after nearly 70 years, they carried with them not only physical experience, but symbolic authority. Their association with Solomon's temple became central to their identity. The temple was no longer just a historical site. It was embedded in their name, their seals, their sense of purpose. In medieval symbolism, Solomon represented divine wisdom, just kingship, and sacred knowledge. To claim lineage, even symbolic, from Solomon was to suggest access to a deeper understanding of God's design. Whether intentional or not, the Templars inherited this aura, and that aura unsettled the Church. Christian theology taught that divine revelation was complete in Christ and interpreted by the Church. Any suggestion of hidden or recovered wisdom risked undermining that authority. If the Templars were believed to possess ancient knowledge predating Christianity, questions would arise. Not just about history, but about hierarchy. Did truth flow only from Rome, or could it be rediscovered elsewhere? There is no evidence that the Templars openly challenged church doctrine during this period. But influence does not require rebellion. Sometimes, merely embodying an alternative source of legitimacy is enough to provoke anxiety. As time passed, the stories surrounding the Temple Mount grew darker and more fantastical. Some claimed the Templars guarded the Ark of the Covenant. Others spoke of secret bloodlines, lost gospels, or knowledge of Christ's true nature. These ideas cannot be verified. Many were shaped by later movements projecting their own beliefs backward. Yet myths often grow where facts are obscured. What remains undeniable is that the Templars' presence beneath Solomon's temple marked a turning point. It placed them at the symbolic heart of sacred history. It connected them to a lineage far older than the medieval church. And it gave their order a mystique that neither kings nor clerics could fully control. Even if they found nothing but stone and dust, the idea that they might have found something was powerful enough. It transformed perception. And perception, in matters of faith and power, can be as dangerous as truth. The Templars themselves never clarified the rumors. Perhaps they did not need to. Silence served them well in life. It would serve them just as well in death, leaving behind questions that history would never conclusively answer. Because what lay beneath the Temple Mount was not just buried stone. It was the possibility that sacred knowledge could exist outside institutional control. And that possibility alone was enough to haunt the Church long after the Templars were gone. As their power grew in Europe, these whispers followed them. Quiet at first, then louder, and eventually deadly. As the Knights Templar settled into their long presence in the East, something subtle but profound began to happen. It did not arrive in the form of rebellion or open disagreement. There were no public sermons challenging doctrine, no written manifestos questioning the authority of the Church. Instead, it came quietly through exposure, through proximity, through knowledge that could not be unseen once encountered. The medieval Christian world was largely closed. Ideas flowed slowly, filtered through monasteries and approved texts. Much of ancient learning had been lost or declared irrelevant, its echoes preserved only in fragments. But the Islamic world was different. In cities like Damascus, Cairo, and Baghdad, scholars preserved and expanded upon the works of ancient Greece and Rome. Mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy flourished in ways Europe had not seen for centuries. The Templars stood at the crossroads of these worlds. Stationed in the Holy Land for decades at a time, they interacted not only with Muslim enemies on the battlefield, but with Muslim administrators, merchants, and scholars in moments of uneasy peace. Trade required negotiation. Truces required communication. Prisoner exchanges required trust, however limited. And through these interactions, ideas traveled. Arabic numerals, advanced accounting methods, medical practices, and architectural techniques were not secrets in the East. They were practical tools used every day. To the Templars, who valued efficiency and order, such tools were invaluable. They adopted what worked regardless of origin. This alone was enough to set them apart from their European contemporaries. Even more significant was their contact with Jewish communities. Jewish scholars had long engaged in deep textual analysis of Scripture, developing mystical traditions that explored the nature of God, creation, and divine law. These ideas did not reject monotheism. They explored it with intensity and nuance. To men raised on rigid catechism, such intellectual freedom could be both unsettling and enlightening. None of this required the Templars to abandon Christianity, but it expanded their intellectual horizon. Faith no longer existed in isolation. It became part of a broader human search for meaning, and that search is difficult to contain. The order's internal culture encouraged discipline and obedience, but it also encouraged learning. Literacy was necessary for administration. Mathematics was necessary for logistics. Architecture was necessary for fortress construction. The Templars became, by necessity, educated men. Not philosophers in the academic sense, but practitioners of applied knowledge. Over time, this produced a subtle shift. The world began to look less like a simple battlefield between good and evil, and more like a complex system of cultures, beliefs, and incentives. Such understanding did not weaken faith, but it changed how faith was expressed. From the perspective of the Church, this was dangerous territory. Christian doctrine depended on clear boundaries. Orthodoxy was defined by what it excluded as much as by what it embraced. When believers began to blur those boundaries, by adopting foreign knowledge, by showing respect for non-Christian traditions, it raised uncomfortable questions. If wisdom existed outside the Church, what did that imply about divine monopoly? The Templars never publicly claimed such wisdom, but their behavior hinted at it. They were pragmatic where others were dogmatic. They negotiated when others demanded annihilation. They learned when others refused to listen. To critics, this looked like compromise. To the Templars, it was survival. Their long exposure to Eastern thought also shaped how they viewed sacred texts. In the Islamic and Jewish traditions, interpretation played a central role. Scripture was debated, questioned, and explored through layers of meaning. This approach contrasted sharply with the medieval church's emphasis on fixed interpretation. Even if the Templars did not adopt these methods formally, they could not avoid being influenced by them. A man who has seen Scripture discussed openly is less likely to believe there is only one permissible question. This intellectual flexibility may help explain some of the later accusations leveled against the order. Charges of secret doctrines, unusual rituals, and unorthodox beliefs did not emerge in a vacuum. They reflected a fear that the Templars had gone too far beyond acceptable boundaries. Whether those fears were justified is another matter entirely. When the Templars returned to Europe, they brought with them practices that appeared advanced and unfamiliar. Their accounting was precise. Their architecture incorporated elements seen in the East. Their organizational structure was efficient and centralized. All of this reinforced the impression that they possessed knowledge others did not. And knowledge, especially when it cannot be easily traced, breeds suspicion. The Church's authority rested on the idea that it was the sole guardian of truth. Councils defined doctrine. Popes interpreted Scripture. Any suggestion that truth could be accessed independently threatened this foundation. The Templars, with their autonomy and apparent expertise, began to look less like servants and more like rivals. Yet the rivalry was unspoken. Outwardly, relations remained formal and respectful. Privileges were reaffirmed. Praise continued. But beneath the surface, a quiet unease grew. This unease intensified as the crusading project faltered. Military defeats in the Holy Land forced introspection. Why was God no longer granting victory? Some blamed sin. Others blamed poor leadership. Still others whispered that God's favor had shifted. In times of failure, societies look for explanations. And explanations often require culprits. The idea that the Templars had absorbed foreign ideas offered a convenient narrative. It suggested contamination, corruption, a loss of purity. Never mind that the Church itself had benefited from centuries of cultural exchange. Never mind that much of Christian theology rested on Greek philosophy preserved by non-Christians. Selective memory is a powerful tool. What mattered was perception. The Templars' knowledge was practical, not doctrinal. They did not preach new gospels. They did not publish treatises. But they operated confidently in a world that frightened others. And confidence, when it cannot be controlled, is often mistaken for arrogance. Some later testimonies accused the Templars of denying Christ or mocking the cross. These claims are difficult to reconcile with what we know of the order's daily life, which was deeply religious. Prayer structured their days. Mass was central. Symbols of faith surrounded them. More likely, these accusations were distortions, attempts to translate fear of the unknown into language of heresy. Because heresy was the ultimate crime. It justified destruction without remorse. The truth may be simpler and more unsettling. The Templars did not abandon Christianity. They expanded it. They encountered a wider intellectual world and adapted. They learned that faith could coexist with reason, that God could be approached through discipline and inquiry as well as obedience. Such an understanding did not threaten God, but it did threaten institutions built on exclusivity. In the end, what the Church feared was not that the Templars worshipped differently, but that they thought differently, that they had glimpsed a broader horizon of knowledge and could not return to a narrower view. Knowledge once gained cannot be erased, can only be suppressed, and suppression, as history would soon reveal, often leaves scars far deeper than the truth ever could. As the order matured and its influence spread across continents, whispers began to circulate. Quiet at first, almost dismissible. They did not come from official records or papal decrees, but from the margins of history. Rumors shared by chroniclers, hints embedded in later testimonies, and patterns that seemed difficult to explain by coincidence alone. These whispers spoke of an inner circle within the Knights Templar, a group bound not just by vows, but by knowledge. On the surface, the Templars were rigidly structured. Every brother followed the same rule. Every action was regulated, from prayer to combat to silence at meals. Obedience was absolute. Individual ambition was discouraged. Such uniformity suggested transparency. And yet, those who studied the order closely noticed something else: layers. Certain knights rose faster than others. Some were entrusted with responsibilities far beyond their rank. A small number moved frequently between distant commanderies, carrying messages never recorded in surviving correspondence. Decisions of great consequence were sometimes made without explanation, communicated only to select brothers. This was not unusual for a military organization. Compartmentalization protects efficiency. But the Templars were not merely military. They were spiritual. And within spiritual communities, secrecy often signals initiation. New recruits underwent ceremonies closed to outsiders. Even other monks were not permitted to observe them. Later accusations would seize upon this secrecy, twisting it into something sinister. But secrecy alone does not imply corruption. Many religious orders protected their rituals from misinterpretation. What made the Templars different was the intensity with which they guarded internal knowledge. Some historians argue that the idea of an inner order is a later invention, fueled by romanticism and conspiracy. That may be true in part. Yet the persistence of the belief suggests it fulfilled a psychological need, an attempt to explain how the Templars could appear so unified on the surface, yet so complex in action. If such an inner circle existed, it would not have been formed for rebellion. It would have been formed for preservation. Knowledge, once acquired, needs custodians. The longer the Templars remained in the East, the more exposed they became to ideas and practices unfamiliar to Europe. Some of this knowledge was practical: engineering, medicine, navigation. Some of it was philosophical: ways of thinking about God, law, and the cosmos that did not fit neatly into Western categories. Not every brother would have been ready to carry such ideas. Many joined for faith and service, not intellectual exploration. An inner group, carefully selected, could safeguard what was learned without disrupting the order's unity. This is how many traditions functioned. Ancient mystery schools operated on graded initiation. So did monastic communities, guilds, and even royal courts. Information was revealed gradually, according to readiness and trust. The Templars valued trust above all else. Within this hypothetical inner circle, loyalty would have been absolute. Members would have shared not just secrets, but a worldview shaped by experience and reflection. They would have understood the fragility of knowledge in a hostile environment. And they would have known that survival often depends on silence. This possibility casts later events in a different light. When accusations of heresy emerged, they often referenced strange practices known only to a few. Kissing rituals, renunciations, symbolic acts misunderstood or deliberately distorted. It is possible that interrogators stumbled upon fragments of internal ceremonies stripped of context. Under torture, even loyal men can confuse symbolism with literal confession. But it is also possible that the interrogators were fishing, that they already believed something was hidden and forced reality to fit expectation. The idea of an inner order terrified the Church for one simple reason: it implied parallel authority. A group within a group, bound by shared understanding rather than external command. If such a circle existed, it would have represented a concentration of influence immune to oversight. Institutions tolerate secrecy when they control it. They fear secrecy they do not. What makes the theory compelling is not a single piece of evidence, but a pattern of behavior. The Templars consistently avoided public explanation. They did not defend themselves with theology when accused. They did not publish refutations. They relied on their reputation and papal protection, assuming it would suffice. This silence can be interpreted as arrogance, or it can be interpreted as discipline, the instinct to protect something fragile by refusing to expose it. If there was knowledge the Church could not fully understand or control, exposing it would have been dangerous not only for the Templars, but for the broader structure of medieval faith. Questions once asked cannot be unasked. And perhaps the Templars understood this better than anyone. The order attracted men of noble birth, many of whom were educated beyond the norm. Younger sons, unlikely to inherit land, often sought purpose in religious service. These men brought with them curiosity and ambition tempered by discipline. Over time, the order may have filtered such men into roles where their intellect mattered. Selection does not require conspiracy. It can happen naturally, through trust built over years of shared hardship. Some brothers would have proven capable of holding complexity without losing faith. Others would not. The survival of the order depended on knowing the difference. After the fall, strange gaps appear in the historical record. Certain documents vanish. Certain names are conspicuously absent from trial records. A few Templars seem to disappear entirely, neither executed nor accounted for. These anomalies have fueled speculation for centuries. Were they simply lost to time? Or were some deliberately protected? If an inner circle existed, its members may have been prepared for collapse. They may have anticipated betrayal. Institutions that grow too powerful inevitably attract enemies. The wiser among them would have known this. Preparation does not require prophecy. It requires pattern recognition. Perhaps contingency plans were made. Knowledge divided. Symbols encoded. Traditions absorbed into other structures. Not to preserve power, but to preserve memory. The idea that all Templars were innocent victims oversimplifies the story. They were human beings navigating an unstable world. Some likely believed too much in their protection. Others may have quietly prepared for the unthinkable. The inner order, if it existed, would not have been about domination or forbidden worship. It would have been about continuity, about ensuring that what had been learned was not lost to fear and fire. This interpretation aligns with the order's deepest values: loyalty, discipline, and sacrifice. Not for personal gain, but for something larger and longer lasting. When the Church moved against the Templars, it did so with remarkable certainty. Accusations were sweeping. Punishment was absolute. This suggests not a careful investigation, but a desire to eliminate ambiguity. Ambiguity is dangerous to authority. Whether the inner order was real or imagined, the fear of it was real. And fear, once unleashed, does not require proof. It requires only belief. In the end, the silence of the Templars speaks louder than any confession. They did not reveal secrets to save themselves. They did not bargain knowledge for mercy. They died, recanted, or vanished, taking whatever truth they carried with them. And perhaps that was the final act of the inner circle, real or symbolic, choosing silence over survival so that something unseen could endure. Because some knowledge, once exposed to the wrong hands, does not illuminate. It destroys. As suspicion deepened around the Knights Templar, attention began to shift from what they did to what they showed. Symbols, once dismissed as decorative or traditional, were suddenly scrutinized with intensity. In a medieval world where most people could not read, images carried meaning far beyond words. And the symbols associated with the Templars did not always fit comfortably within the expectations of Orthodox Christianity. The most famous of these symbols was the red cross worn on the white mantle. To supporters, it represented martyrdom and sacrifice. To critics, it became a mark of unsettling authority. But beyond the familiar cross were stranger images, ones that appeared in seals, carvings, and whispered testimony. One of the most unsettling was the skull. Skulls were not inherently unchristian. Medieval art often used them as reminders of mortality, symbols of repentance and humility. Memento mori, remember that you will die. Monks meditated on skulls to detach themselves from earthly vanity. Yet when skulls appeared in association with the Templars, the context felt different. Rumors suggested not reflection, but reverence. Some claimed the order kept a severed head, treated with ritual importance. Others spoke of skulls used in secret ceremonies, kissed or addressed with words outsiders were not meant to hear. These stories emerged most clearly during the trials, under conditions where truth and survival became entangled. It is difficult to know what to make of them. Torture has a way of reshaping memory. Under extreme pain, symbolic acts can be misunderstood, exaggerated, or completely invented to satisfy interrogators. A ceremonial reminder of death could become, in the retelling, an idol. A symbolic gesture could be transformed into blasphemy. Still, the persistence of skull imagery demands examination. In many ancient traditions, the skull symbolized not death alone, but knowledge, the seat of the mind, the vessel of consciousness. In Eastern philosophy, skulls sometimes represented transformation, the shedding of illusion to reveal truth. In alchemical symbolism, death was not an end, but a stage in rebirth. If the Templars had absorbed ideas from the East, as evidence suggests, their symbolic language may have expanded accordingly. This does not imply rejection of Christianity. Medieval Christianity itself was rich with layered symbolism. The difference lay in interpretation. To a church increasingly anxious about deviation, layered symbolism could appear threatening. Another figure frequently associated with the Templars was the so-called double-headed image. Some seals depict figures with two faces, or heads joined in unsettling ways. Such imagery was rare in Orthodox Christian iconography, where clarity and hierarchy were emphasized. Duality raised questions. Two heads suggested two perspectives, two truths. In later accusations, this duality would be framed as deception. One face shown to the world, another hidden. But duality can also represent balance. Heaven and earth, body and soul, action and contemplation. The Templars lived in constant tension between these dualities. They were monks who killed, warriors who prayed, men sworn to poverty who managed wealth. Their entire existence was a contradiction held together by discipline. It is not surprising that their symbols reflected this complexity. Then there were the whispered gestures, initiation rites involving touch, proximity, or symbolic renunciation. In a culture deeply sensitive to bodily symbolism, such acts were easily misread. A ritual meant to test obedience could be recast as humiliation. A symbolic rejection of worldly identity could be interpreted as denial of faith. During the trials, inquisitors asked leading questions. Did the initiate spit on the cross? Did he deny Christ? Did he swear secret oaths? Under such pressure, even innocent acts could be reframed. Consider the possibility that some rituals involved symbolic denial, not of Christ, but of the self. Monastic traditions often required symbolic death to the old life. Words spoken in ritual contexts are not literal statements of belief. They are tools of transformation. But inquisitors were not interested in nuance. The Church's fear was not rooted in any single symbol, but in the pattern they formed. The Templars' imagery did not align neatly with the visual language the Church used to assert control. It was ambiguous, dense, resistant to simple explanation. Ambiguity is dangerous to institutions that rely on clarity. Symbols gain power when they are shared quietly, when they are understood by some but not all, when they mark belonging without explanation. To outsiders, such symbols feel exclusionary. To authorities, they feel subversive. The skull, the double figure, the sealed gestures, taken individually, they prove nothing. Taken together, they suggest a symbolic system operating beneath the surface of official doctrine. This does not mean the Templars practiced forbidden religion. It means they may have expressed their faith in ways shaped by experience rather than prescription. The Church had long tolerated symbolic diversity within limits, but those limits tightened as pressure mounted. Heresy was no longer defined solely by belief, but by deviation from approved expression. How one worshipped became as important as what one believed. In that climate, the Templar symbols became liabilities. Later generations would exaggerate these elements into full-blown myths. Occult orders would claim Templar lineage. Romantic writers would turn skulls into relics of forbidden wisdom. Modern conspiracy theories would stretch symbolism into fantasy. But stripping away the excess leaves something more human. The Templars were men living at the edge of known worlds. They absorbed ideas, practices, and images from multiple cultures. They expressed their identity through symbols that resonated with their lived reality. Those symbols were not designed to threaten the Church, but they did. Because symbols bypass reason. They work on emotion, and fear responds to symbols faster than logic ever could. When accusations came, the Church did not need proof of heresy. It needed a story that felt true. Symbols provided that story. A skull could become an idol. A ritual could become blasphemy. Ambiguity could become guilt. The tragedy lies in the possibility that what the Templars intended as reminders of humility, mortality, and inner discipline were recast as evidence of corruption. If so, then the symbols that once bound the order together became weapons used against it. History often punishes those who speak in images when power demands plain words. By the time the trials began, it no longer mattered what the symbols meant to the Templars. Meaning had been seized and reassigned. The Church defined interpretation. The Crown enforced it. And the order, bound by silence and discipline, did not or could not explain itself. Symbols are powerful precisely because they survive explanation. They linger after words fail, and long after the Templars were gone, their symbols remained, etched into stone, preserved in rumor, haunting the edges of history, not as proof of guilt, but as reminders that faith expressed beyond rigid boundaries is often the first to be condemned. Because when belief becomes too complex to control, it is easier to call it heresy than to try to understand it. Few names in medieval history carry as much fear and confusion as the word that would become inseparably linked to the fall of the Knights Templar. It appeared suddenly in the accusations, spoken in hushed tones during interrogations and written into trial records as if its meaning were already understood. Baphomet, a name that seemed to arrive fully formed, yet explained nothing. To the men accused of invoking it, the word itself was often unfamiliar. Some claimed they had never heard it before their arrest. Others repeated it hesitantly, unsure of its significance, only after enduring prolonged torture. There was no single description, no consistent form. Sometimes it was said to be a head, sometimes a figure, sometimes nothing more than a word. This inconsistency is the first clue. In a genuine cult, symbols are shared, defined, and reinforced. Believers know what they worship. They recognize it. They describe it with confidence. The testimonies surrounding Baphomet do none of these things. Instead, they shift wildly depending on region, interrogator, and level of suffering. One knight described a bearded head. Another spoke of a cat. Another mentioned a face with 3 aspects. Some denied any idol existed at all, even while confessing to other charges. These contradictions would normally cast doubt on the entire accusation. But in a climate of fear, inconsistency was not seen as evidence of falsehood. It was interpreted as proof of secrecy. The church framed Baphomet as a demon, a false god, a direct inversion of Christian worship. This framing was powerful because it required no explanation. The medieval mind was steeped in the language of spiritual warfare. Demons were real. Idols were dangerous. To accuse someone of worshipping a false entity was to place them outside the protection of faith entirely. Yet the name itself raises questions. Linguists have long noted that Baphomet bears resemblance to the name Muhammad, often rendered as Muhammad in medieval Christian texts. During the Crusades, Muslims were frequently accused of worshipping Muhammad as a god, a misunderstanding that persisted despite being incorrect. To label the Templars with a name derived from this confusion would have been a devastating insult, associating them with the enemy they had fought for generations. If Baphomet was a corruption of Muhammad, then the accusation becomes less about secret worship and more about symbolic treason. It suggests that the Templars had gone native, that they had absorbed foreign beliefs, that they had crossed an invisible line separating Christian and non-Christian worlds. But this explanation, while compelling, is incomplete. Other interpretations suggest Baphomet was not a name at all, but a cipher, a distortion of words like Sophia, meaning wisdom, or a coded reference to hidden knowledge. Some later thinkers proposed it represented balance, duality, or the reconciliation of opposites. These interpretations are speculative, shaped by much later traditions. They cannot be retroactively imposed with certainty. What matters more is how the word was used. During interrogations, inquisitors did not ask open-ended questions. They asked leading ones. Did you worship Baphomet? Did you kiss the idol? Did you deny Christ in its presence? Once a framework is established, answers tend to follow its shape, especially under pain. Torture does not reveal truth. It reveals compliance. A man in agony will grasp at anything that might end his suffering. If he is told a name and asked to confirm it, he may repeat it. If he is shown an object and told it is an idol, he may agree. Memory fractures under extreme stress. Meaning dissolves. This is why the Baphomet testimonies are so unreliable. Yet the Church treated them as conclusive. Why? Because the accusation of idol worship served a purpose beyond fact-finding. It transformed the Templars from political inconvenience into spiritual threat. A corrupt order could be reformed. A heretical one had to be destroyed. By introducing Baphomet, the narrative shifted. The trials were no longer about finances, power, or autonomy. They were about salvation and damnation. And in that arena, mercy is often absent. It is also telling that no physical idol was ever produced. Despite extensive searches of Templar properties, no universally recognized object matching the descriptions was found. A few carved heads were presented, but their origins were uncertain and their connection to the order tenuous at best. In a medieval trial, physical evidence mattered. Relics were displayed. Objects were paraded. The absence of a definitive idol should have undermined the case. Instead, it was explained away as further proof of cunning concealment. This circular logic ensured conviction regardless of facts. Some historians suggest Baphomet was simply a name given to any unauthorized symbol, a placeholder for anxiety. Others argue it was a misunderstanding of internal Templar symbolism, perhaps a relic venerated as a reminder of sacrifice or mortality. A skull, for example, could be transformed into a demon through the lens of fear. Still others believe Baphomet never existed at all, neither as idol nor symbol, but was entirely constructed by interrogators as a rhetorical weapon. This possibility is not as radical as it sounds. The medieval church had long used heretical archetypes to police boundaries. Accusations of secret worship, obscene rituals, and inverted symbols were common in cases against groups perceived as threatening. Similar charges were leveled against early Christians by Romans, against Jews by Christians, and against various heretical sects throughout history. Baphomet fits this pattern perfectly. It was vague enough to be adapted, foreign enough to feel dangerous, and undefined enough to absorb whatever fears the accuser projected onto it. For the Templars, this was devastating. Their discipline prevented them from articulating a unified defense. Their secrecy prevented them from explaining rituals without violating internal trust. Their faith prevented them from renouncing God, but that faith was now being redefined by others. They were trapped between silence and confession, and Baphomet stood at the center of that trap. Over time, the name took on a life of its own. Later occult traditions reimagined Baphomet as a goat-headed figure symbolizing rebellion and hidden wisdom. These later images have little to do with the medieval trials, but they retroactively colored perception. What began as a vague accusation became a concrete symbol of darkness. This distortion has obscured the original injustice. The real question is not what Baphomet was, but why the accusation was believed. It was believed because it confirmed existing fears. It explained the Templars' power, wealth, and independence. It provided a moral justification for seizure and execution. It turned a complex political conflict into a simple moral narrative. And simple narratives are easier to enforce. If the Templars had truly worshipped a demon, their destruction would have been righteous. If they had merely grown too powerful, their destruction would have been inconvenient to justify. Baphomet solved that problem. In the end, the name tells us more about the accusers than the accused. It reveals how fear transforms ignorance into certainty, how authority manufactures symbols to maintain control, and how easily truth is sacrificed when belief is weaponized. Whatever the Templars truly believed, Baphomet was not their god. It was the Church's invention, a mirror reflecting its own anxiety back at itself. And once that mirror was raised, there was no turning away from what followed. Power rarely destroys from the outside. More often, it corrodes from within, turning allies into liabilities and gratitude into resentment. By the early 14th century, this quiet corrosion had reached a breaking point in France, embodied in a single man whose ambitions and anxieties would shape the fate of the Knights Templar more than any accusation of heresy ever could. King Philip IV of France was not a weak ruler. He was intelligent, determined, and relentless. He sought to strengthen the monarchy, centralize authority, and free the crown from dependence on external forces, whether noble families, the papacy, or financial creditors. And in this pursuit, the Knights Templar stood as an uncomfortable obstacle. Philip inherited a kingdom strained by constant warfare, conflicts with England, campaigns in Flanders, and internal unrest drained the royal treasury year after year. War demanded money, administration demanded money, authority demanded money, and the crown never seemed to have enough. To bridge this gap, Philip borrowed. He borrowed heavily, from Italian bankers, from Jewish financiers, and increasingly from the Knights Templar. At first, the relationship appeared mutually beneficial. The Templars provided secure loans. The king received funds without immediate consequence. But debt is never neutral, creates imbalance, and imbalance breeds resentment. The more Philip relied on the Templars, the more their independence gnawed at him. They did not bow. They did not negotiate as subjects. They operated as an autonomous institution, protected by papal authority. Their wealth was not his to command. Their fortresses were not his to seize. In his own kingdom, they stood beyond his reach. For a king determined to assert absolute sovereignty, this was intolerable. Philip had already demonstrated how he dealt with inconvenient powers. He expelled the Jews from France, seizing their property and canceling debts owed to them. He arrested Lombard bankers, confiscating assets when their usefulness ended. In each case, Financial desperation was cloaked in moral or political justification. The Templars, however, were more complicated. They were popular, respected, and deeply entwined with the Church. To move against them required more than force. It required legitimacy. That legitimacy would come through narrative. Philip understood the power of accusation. Heresy, once alleged, carried enormous weight. It stripped the accused of protection and justified extreme measures. If the Templars could be recast not as creditors, but as enemies of God, their destruction would appear righteous rather than opportunistic. The king did not act alone. He cultivated influence within the Church, pressuring a papacy already weakened by political instability. Pope Clement V, a Frenchman elevated in part through Philip's support, found himself trapped between loyalty and survival. Philip presented the Templars as a threat not only to the crown, but to Christianity itself. He framed their secrecy as deception, their wealth as corruption, their independence as defiance. The accusations of idol worship and blasphemy fit neatly into this framework. It is unlikely Philip cared deeply whether the accusations were true. What mattered was that they were believable. France had changed. Faith remained powerful, but skepticism toward institutions was growing. The Church itself faced criticism. In this environment, the idea that a powerful order had fallen into corruption resonated. The Templars' mystique, once their strength, now worked against them. Philip moved carefully, gathering testimony from disgruntled former members and outsiders. He did not seek balanced investigation. He sought ammunition, and he found enough to justify his next step. The arrests of October 1307 were not impulsive. They were meticulously planned. Orders were sealed and distributed simultaneously across the kingdom to prevent warning or escape. This level of coordination required months of preparation and the cooperation of royal officials who trusted the king's judgment. When the arrests occurred, the Church was caught off guard. The Pope had not authorized them. But once the machinery of accusation was in motion, reversing it became nearly impossible. Public perception shifted instantly. Silence from Rome was interpreted as confirmation. Philip controlled the narrative from the beginning. Under royal custody, Templars were interrogated using methods officially condemned but routinely practiced. Confessions poured in. Some were retracted. Others contradicted one another. But in the court of public opinion, volume mattered more than consistency. The king framed himself as defender of the faith, reluctantly uncovering corruption within a once holy institution. This portrayal masked the financial reality beneath. By dissolving the order, Philip stood to erase massive debts and seize valuable properties. The coincidence was too convenient to ignore. Yet Philip's actions were not driven by greed alone. They were driven by fear. The Templars represented a model of power that threatened his vision of kingship. They operated across borders. They answered to a higher authority. They controlled resources independent of royal command. In an age moving toward centralized states, such entities were anachronisms and dangers. Philip sought to build a France where all power flowed through the crown. To do so, he needed to eliminate alternative centers of influence. The Templars were the most visible but not the only example. What makes Philip's role particularly chilling is how effectively he weaponized faith. He did not attack the Church directly. He used its language. He framed his actions as obedience to God rather than defiance. In doing so, he turned the Church's own moral authority into a tool of destruction. The Pope's eventual compliance was not wholehearted. Clement V hesitated, questioned, and attempted to assert control. But hesitation is weakness in a crisis. Philip pressed relentlessly. He convened councils. He demanded judgment. He implied consequences. In the end, the papacy capitulated. The fall of the Templars became a precedent, a demonstration of what happens when financial power, spiritual authority, and political ambition collide. The strongest force is often not the most righteous, but the most coordinated. Philip IV emerged with his debts diminished and his authority reinforced. But his victory came at a cost. Trust in institutions eroded further. The idea that holiness guaranteed protection was shattered. and the Church's willingness to sacrifice its own servants for political expedience left a stain that would not fade. The Templars had once protected kings with their swords and their vaults. In the end, that protection counted for nothing. History often remembers Philip as a strong ruler. It rarely asks what kind of strength requires the destruction of allies under false pretenses. The truth is that the Templars did not fall because they were weak or corrupt. They fell because they were inconvenient. And when power feels threatened, it rarely asks whether its actions are just, only whether they are effective. The night the Templars were arrested was not the triumph of faith over heresy. It was the moment a king chose a scapegoat over accountability. And in doing so, he rewrote history to serve his own survival. At the center of the storm stood a man who never asked for it. Pope Clement V was not a revolutionary, nor a zealot. He was cautious, diplomatic, and deeply aware of the fragile balance he was expected to maintain. Yet history would remember him not for what he believed, but for what he allowed. When the first reports of mass arrests reached him, Clement was alarmed. The Knights Templar were a papal order, answerable to Rome alone. No king had the authority to seize them without papal consent. In theory, this was a direct challenge to the supremacy of the Church. In practice, it was far more complicated. Clement owed his position, in part, to King Philip IV. The French crown had exerted immense pressure during his election, ensuring that a French pope would ascend the throne. The papacy itself had already been weakened by political turmoil, forced to relocate from Rome to Avignon, placing it physically and symbolically closer to French influence. This was not a position of strength. Clement faced a terrible dilemma. To defend the Templars outright would mean confronting Philip, a confrontation the papacy was ill-equipped to win. To condemn them without investigation would undermine the Church's claim to justice. And to remain silent risked appearing complicit. At first, Clement attempted a middle path. He demanded that the king hand over the prisoners to papal authority. He questioned the legality of the arrests. He expressed skepticism about the accusations. Privately, he doubted their truth. But doubt alone does not stop momentum. Philip flooded the Church with confessions. Documents piled up, each one stamped with seals, signatures, and testimonies extracted under royal supervision. The sheer volume created an illusion of certainty. Even if individual statements were unreliable, together they seemed overwhelming. Clement requested an independent inquiry. But independence was already compromised. The accused were in royal custody. The interrogators were royal officials. The environment was hostile. There would be no clean separation between investigation and punishment. The Pope found himself negotiating not truth, but damage control. As public opinion hardened, Clement grew increasingly concerned about scandal. The Church's authority rested on the perception of moral clarity. To openly defend an order accused of grotesque crimes risked tainting the entire institution. If the Templars were innocent, the Church would appear weak for failing to protect them. If they were guilty, the Church would appear corrupt for having elevated them. Either outcome was dangerous, so Clement chose preservation over confrontation. He authorized limited inquiries, carefully worded and tightly controlled. He allowed the trials to proceed, while reserving final judgment for himself. This gave the appearance of oversight without the substance. The machinery of accusation continued largely unchecked. When some Templars attempted to defend themselves, recanting earlier confessions and appealing directly to the Pope, their voices were drowned out. Legal procedure moved slowly. Executions moved quickly. Clement's greatest fear was schism. The Church was already divided by competing loyalties and reform movements. To openly oppose a powerful monarch could fracture Christendom further. The Pope convinced himself that unity, even if imperfect, was preferable to chaos. This was the logic of compromise, and it came at a terrible price. As months turned into years, Clement's initial hesitation hardened into acceptance. He convened councils. He listened to advisors who urged caution. He weighed the consequences of inaction. Each delay made reversal less likely. Each execution made exoneration more impossible. Eventually, Clement issued the bull that effectively dissolved the order, not because it was proven guilty, but because it was, in his words, irreparably scandalized. This distinction mattered to him. It allowed him to avoid declaring the Templars heretical while still removing them from existence. It was a legal fiction designed to soothe conscience. But legal fiction does not erase reality. By choosing expedience, the Church sacrificed principle. It signaled that loyalty to power could outweigh loyalty to truth. The message was subtle but devastating. Holiness offered no guarantee of protection if it conflicted with political necessity. For the Templars, this was betrayal of the deepest kind. They had trusted papal authority above all else. They had built their identity around obedience to Rome. And when the moment came, Rome stepped aside. Clement may have believed he was minimizing harm. But harm, once unleashed, does not negotiate. Hundreds of Templars were imprisoned. Many died under torture. Others were executed. Their property was seized. Their names were blackened. The Pope attempted to redirect Templar assets to other orders, framing the dissolution as a reorganization rather than destruction. This administrative gesture did nothing to ease the suffering of those still in chains. History has often judged Clement harshly. Some call him weak. Others call him complicit. Perhaps he was both. But he was also human, trapped in a system where moral clarity demanded courage he did not possess. What makes his decision especially haunting is that he may have known the truth. Clement had access to information others did not. He saw contradictions in the confessions. He heard reports of torture. He understood the king's motivations. Yet he chose silence, not because he believed the Templars guilty, but because he feared the consequences of saying otherwise. This choice reshaped the relationship between church and state. It demonstrated that spiritual authority could be bent by political pressure, that the papacy, once feared by kings, could now be coerced. The long-term consequences were profound. Trust eroded. Cynicism grew. Reform movements gained momentum. The seeds of future challenges to church authority were sown in this moment of compromise. For the Templars, there would be no redemption. Their story ended not with a clear verdict, but with quiet erasure. Their order dissolved by decree, their legacy left to rumor and speculation. The tragedy is not only that the Church failed to protect them. It is that the Church taught the world how easily faith could be subordinated to power. In choosing survival over justice, Clement preserved the institution but wounded its soul. And the echo of that decision would linger long after the last Templar had been silenced, whispering a question that history still struggles to answer. What is the worth of authority if it cannot defend the innocent when it matters most? By the time dawn broke on Friday the 13th, the damage was already done. The arrests had been swift, silent, and absolute. What followed was not an investigation, but a descent, a carefully orchestrated collapse disguised as justice. The Knights Templar awoke that morning not as accused men awaiting explanation, but as condemned prisoners already stripped of identity. Their white mantles were taken from them, their crosses removed. In their place came chains, dark cells, and a single, suffocating message. The world they trusted had turned against them. Across France, interrogations began almost immediately. There was no cooling period, no preparation, no opportunity to consult counsel or appeal to Rome. The machinery had been built for speed, not fairness. The objective was not to discover truth, but to secure confirmation. The questions followed a pattern. They were not neutral inquiries, but statements framed as demands. Did you deny Christ? Did you spit on the cross? Did you worship the idol called Baphomet? Each question assumed guilt. Each refusal was met with escalation. The methods used were officially condemned by church law, yet widely practiced. Stretching racks, strappado, confinement in darkness, deprivation of sleep, pain administered not as punishment, but as persuasion. The interrogators believed or claimed to believe that suffering revealed hidden truth. In reality, it revealed desperation. Men who had endured years of war, starvation, and injury found themselves broken by a different kind of violence. This was not the chaos of battle. It was controlled, systematic, intimate. Pain delivered slowly with expectation. Confession offered as the only path to relief. Many resisted at first. They denied the accusations. They insisted on their faith. They appealed to God, to the Pope, to reason. But pain erodes certainty. Memory fractures. Words lose meaning. Eventually, some began to speak. Confessions poured in, but they were inconsistent, fragmented, and often incoherent. One man admitted to denying Christ during initiation, then recanted the next day. Another claimed to have seen an idol, but could not describe it. Some admitted to spitting near a cross. Others said they were told to do so symbolically. Still others denied it entirely. Under normal circumstances, such contradictions would have undermined the case. Instead, they were interpreted as evidence of secrecy. The more confused the testimony, the more sinister the narrative became. Silence was treated as defiance. Defiance as guilt. Those who refused to confess were punished more severely. Those who confessed were rewarded with temporary relief, only to be questioned again later. This cycle trained prisoners to comply. Over time, confessions became rehearsed. Interrogators guided answers. Language hardened into formula. The process created its own truth. Outside the prisons, news traveled quickly. The public heard of blasphemy, idol worship, and obscene rites. Details were exaggerated. Fear filled the gaps left by uncertainty. The Templars' secrecy, once seen as discipline, now appeared damning. Few stopped to ask why an order trusted for generations had suddenly collapsed into heresy overnight. The Pope's envoys attempted to intervene, but their authority was limited. By the time papal inquiries began, many Templars had already confessed under royal interrogation. These confessions followed them like shadows, shaping every subsequent hearing. Those who attempted to retract their statements faced brutal consequences. Recantation was treated as relapse into heresy, a crime worse than the original accusation. Several men who withdrew confessions were burned alive as relapsed heretics, their deaths serving as warnings to others. This created an impossible choice: live by lying or die by telling the truth. The order's leaders were not spared. High-ranking officials were interrogated with the same brutality. Their confessions carried greater weight, regardless of how they were obtained. When respected commanders broke under torture, their words were used to validate the entire case. The spectacle mattered as much as the outcome. Trials were public. Confessions were read aloud. The image of the fallen Templar was carefully constructed, no longer a protector of pilgrims, but a deceiver hiding darkness behind a holy facade. Once that image took hold, defending the order became socially dangerous. Even those who doubted the accusations remained silent. Within the prisons, the psychological toll was immense. Men accustomed to communal life were isolated. Prayer was restricted. Hope eroded. Some died before judgment was passed, their bodies collapsing under strain. Others survived long enough to be forgotten. The Church's official position remained cautious, but ineffective. Pope Clement authorized further inquiries, yet did little to halt the violence. His words could not keep pace with events already set in motion. By the time ecclesiastical courts formally reviewed the evidence, the outcome was predetermined. The order's reputation had been destroyed, its unity shattered, its defenders silenced. The few Templars who spoke clearly and consistently in their defense were ignored. Their statements did not fit the narrative. In a system driven by confirmation, inconvenient truths are invisible. What unfolded was not a trial in the true sense, but a ritual of condemnation. A performance designed to justify a decision already made. The tragedy lies not only in the suffering inflicted, but in how quickly it was normalized. Torture became procedure. Confession became currency. Justice became secondary to outcome. And through it all, the Templars' greatest strength, their obedience, became their undoing. They did not rebel. They did not organize resistance. They trusted that truth would prevail, that the Church would intervene, that reason would assert itself. It did not. The Friday arrests were meant to be decisive. But the true destruction came afterward, in the slow grind of interrogation and fear. Day by day, the order was dismantled not by swords, but by paperwork and pain. What emerged from the prisons was not truth, but silence. Broken men, contradictory records, a legacy permanently stained. And yet, for all the cruelty, something remarkable happened. Some Templars held firm. They endured torture without confession. They faced execution without recantation. They maintained their faith even as the institutions they served abandoned them. These men do not dominate the historical record. Their silence was less useful to power than lies. But their existence complicates the story. If the Templars were truly guilty, why did so many refuse to confess even to save their lives? Why did recantations appear the moment pain ceased? Why did the narrative require such force to sustain itself? The answer lies not in heresy, but in fear. Fear of an order too powerful to control. Fear of knowledge too difficult to contain. Fear of admitting that authority had acted unjustly. The arrests of Friday the 13th were not the end of the Knights Templar. They were the beginning of a process designed to erase them body, reputation, and memory. And the most haunting truth is this. Once such a process begins, it rarely stops with its intended target. It reshapes the world around it, teaching institutions that power does not need truth to prevail, only silence. What followed the arrests was not an unraveling of hidden truth, but the deliberate manufacturing of it. The confessions that would condemn the Knights Templar were not discovered like buried relics. They were forged in darkness, pain, and exhaustion, shaped by expectation rather than memory. In the medieval imagination, confession held sacred power. To confess was to cleanse the soul, to align oneself once more with God. But in the hands of inquisitors, confession became something else entirely, a tool. It no longer revealed truth. It produced it. The Templars were interrogated in cells designed to break the body and disorient the mind. Many were kept in darkness for days, sometimes weeks. Sleep was interrupted. Food was scarce. Time lost its shape. When questioning began, it did not begin gently. It began with certainty. Interrogators already knew what they wanted to hear. They spoke of secret rituals, of idols, of denials of Christ. They asked questions not to understand, but to confirm. A man who denied everything was told others had already confessed. A man who resisted was reminded that suffering would continue until he spoke. Pain was administered methodically. The strappado, where a man's hands were bound behind his back and he was hoisted into the air before being dropped suddenly. Dislocated shoulders and tore muscles. The rack stretched joints until they screamed. Some were burned. Others suffocated slowly. Each method had a purpose, to make the body betray the mind. Under such conditions, words lose meaning. Many Templars confessed simply to survive the moment. They repeated phrases suggested to them. They nodded when asked if something had occurred, even if they did not understand the question. Some later admitted they would have said anything. And then, when the pain stopped, clarity returned. That is when recantations began. Men who had confessed under torture stood before ecclesiastical courts and withdrew their statements. They insisted they had lied. They swore on Scripture that the accusations were false. They begged to be heard. In a just system, these recantations would have mattered. Instead, they sealed their fate. To recant was to admit that one had lied under oath, a grave offense. Worse, it was interpreted as relapse into heresy. The logic was unforgiving. A man who confessed and then denied was not correcting falsehood. He was proving duplicity. The system punished honesty. Those who maintained their confessions, even if false, were often spared execution. Those who recanted were burned alive. This brutal calculus sent a clear message to the remaining prisoners. Silence or contradiction meant death. As a result, later confessions became more consistent. Not because they were truer, but because survival demanded conformity. Inquisitors took these later, more polished confessions as validation. They ignored the circumstances under which they were obtained. They ignored the patterns of retraction. They ignored the obvious incentives shaping testimony. What mattered was that the narrative now held. The language of the confessions is telling. Phrases repeat across regions. Descriptions mirror one another too closely to be organic. This suggests coaching, not memory. It suggests that interrogators supplied vocabulary that prisoners adopted. Words like idol, denial, and secret oath recur with unnatural regularity. In contrast, details, names, places, sequences remain vague. This imbalance reveals the confession's artificial nature. A true confession is rich in specific memory. A forced one is built from abstractions. Some Templars, especially those of higher rank, attempted to resist longer. They understood the implications of confession beyond their own survival. They knew their words would condemn others. Their resistance made them targets. When even they eventually broke, their statements were celebrated as definitive proof. Rank conferred credibility, even when credibility had been destroyed by torture. The Church later attempted to distance itself from these methods, claiming royal officials were responsible. This distinction offered little comfort to the dead. The most disturbing aspect of the confessions is not that they were false, but that everyone involved knew they might be. Interrogators, clerics, and officials were not ignorant of torture's effects. Medieval legal texts acknowledged that pain could produce lies. Yet the process continued. Why? Because the outcome mattered more than the truth. The confessions served a function. They justified arrests. They legitimized seizure of property. They silenced dissent. Once that function was fulfilled, their reliability became irrelevant. The system did not collapse under contradiction because it was not designed to test truth. It was designed to produce closure. The human cost was staggering. Men who had dedicated their lives to faith were forced to speak against it. Brothers betrayed brothers with words they did not believe. The psychological damage extended far beyond the physical. Some prisoners descended into despair, others into numbness. A few clung to faith with quiet determination, refusing to confess even under unbearable pain. These men rarely appear in official records. Silence leaves little trace. What survives is the voice of power. Later generations would read these confessions without context, treating them as windows into secret rites. They would debate whether the Templars truly denied Christ or worshipped idols. Rarely would they ask the more important question: could any confession extracted this way be trusted at all? The answer, obvious to modern minds, was inconvenient then. By the time the trials reached their later stages, the confessions had become self-reinforcing. They were cited in councils, quoted in decrees, used to persuade hesitant authorities. Their origins faded as their authority grew. This is how falsehood becomes history. It does not arrive loudly. It accumulates. Each repetition lends it weight. Each official endorsement seals it further. Eventually, questioning it feels radical, even dangerous. For the Templars still alive, hope dwindled. Appeals to Rome moved slowly. The Pope's inquiries lagged behind events. Executions proceeded. Prisons emptied not through release, but through death. Those who survived carried the burden of words they wished they had never spoken. Some lived quietly in monastic exile. Others disappeared from record. Their inner lives remain unknown, but the pattern is clear. The confessions did not reveal what the Templars believed. They revealed what their persecutors needed them to say. They tell us about fear, fear of power beyond control, fear of institutions losing authority, fear of admitting injustice once it has begun. In the end, the confessions became the cornerstone of the case against the order. Yet they were the weakest part of it. History has often been written by victors. In this case, it was written by those who held the instruments of pain. And that should give us pause. Because when suffering is mistaken for proof, and silence is mistaken for guilt, no institution, no matter how righteous it claims to be, is immune from becoming an engine of injustice. The voices that mattered most were never heard clearly. They were distorted, broken, or extinguished. All that remains are echoes, whispers of truth buried beneath pages of forced words, reminding us that confession, when torn from the body, speaks more about power than belief. What unfolded next carried the appearance of justice, but none of its substance. Courts were convened. Clerics assembled. Documents were read aloud. From a distance, it resembled due process. Up close, it was something else entirely, a ritual designed to legitimize an outcome already decided. The trials of the Knights Templar were not uniform. They varied by region, by authority, and by political pressure. But they shared a defining characteristic. The verdict existed before the hearing began. Everything else was performance. In theory, the Templars were entitled to defend themselves before ecclesiastical courts. In theory, evidence would be weighed, witnesses examined, confessions scrutinized. In practice, the accused entered the courtroom already marked. Their earlier confessions, obtained under torture, followed them like shadows. Those who attempted to challenge the accusations faced insurmountable obstacles. They were often denied access to legal counsel. They were separated from one another, preventing coordination or collective defense. Many were still weakened by imprisonment and pain. Speaking clearly under such conditions was nearly impossible. Some tried anyway. They stood before judges and recanted. They declared their innocence. They described the torture they had endured. They insisted that their confessions were lies born of suffering. These moments should have shaken the proceedings. Instead, they hardened them. Recantation was interpreted not as correction, but as deceit. The legal logic was brutal. A man who confessed under torture and later withdrew his statement was assumed to be lying in one of those moments. The system chose to believe the version that served its purpose. Judges rarely questioned how confessions were obtained. Torture, though officially restricted, was tacitly accepted. Its results were treated as evidence rather than contamination. The courts leaned heavily on written records supplied by royal officials. These documents carried seals and signatures, lending them an air of authority. Rarely did the judges consider the environment in which they were produced. The imbalance of power was absolute. In many cases, the trials were conducted without witnesses to the alleged crimes. No physical idols were presented. No public demonstrations of blasphemy were observed. The case rested almost entirely on testimony extracted in secret. This alone should have raised doubts. Yet doubt was unwelcome. The Church faced immense pressure to resolve the matter quickly. Prolonged uncertainty risked further scandal. The existence of an order accused of heresy threatened the Church's moral standing. Swift resolution, even if imperfect, promised stability. And stability, in times of crisis, often outweighs justice. In some regions, local bishops showed reluctance. They questioned the evidence. They delayed proceedings. But such resistance was isolated and easily overridden by higher authority. Royal pressure ensured compliance. Papal legates, tasked with oversight, often deferred rather than confront. The outcome varied only in severity, not in direction. Some Templars were sentenced to life imprisonment. Others were forced into monastic exile. Those who recanted publicly were executed as relapsed heretics. The harshest punishments were reserved for those who refused to align their testimony with the accepted narrative. The most chilling aspect of the trials was their impersonality. Judges spoke of doctrine and procedure while men stood broken before them. Legal language replaced moral responsibility. Suffering became an abstraction. This detachment allowed cruelty to masquerade as order. By the time the Council of Vienne convened in 1311, the fate of the order was sealed. The council was meant to deliver a final judgment. Instead, it revealed how little judgment remained. The evidence against the Templars was reviewed, but not rigorously tested. Clement V himself acknowledged that the case lacked definitive proof of heresy. Yet he also acknowledged that the scandal surrounding the order had become irreversible. This admission was extraordinary. It meant the order was not being condemned for proven crimes, but dissolved to preserve public confidence. The distinction mattered to legal scholars. It meant little to the men who had already suffered. Clement issued the bull dissolving the order, citing not guilt, but necessity. He claimed the decision was made for the good of the Church, to avoid further division. The language was careful, almost apologetic. But apology does not undo injustice. The trials continued in various forms even after the dissolution. Property was redistributed. Former Templars were reassigned or imprisoned. Some faded into obscurity. Others met violent ends. The legal process had achieved its goal. The order no longer existed. What remained was a record filled with contradictions, gaps, and silences. Future historians would struggle to make sense of it. Some would accept the verdict. Others would question it. But the damage was irreversible. The trial that was meant to clarify the truth had instead buried it. The Church's role in this outcome remains one of the most troubling aspects of the entire affair. By allowing political pressure to shape legal process, it compromised its own moral authority. By valuing appearance over fairness, it taught rulers a dangerous lesson, that justice could be molded to serve power. The Templars were not the last to suffer under such logic. What makes this trial especially haunting is how ordinary it became. There was no single moment of dramatic collapse, no declaration of tyranny. Instead, there was procedure, paperwork, meetings, votes, all the mechanisms of legitimacy. In this way, the trials resemble many injustices throughout history. They remind us that cruelty does not always wear the face of rage. Sometimes, it wears robes, speaks calmly, and follows rules designed to exclude mercy. For the Knights Templar, the courtroom offered no sanctuary. It was merely another chamber of confinement, one where words replaced chains, but restraint remained absolute. The tragedy is not only that the verdict was unjust. It is that the process made injustice appear lawful. And once injustice is given the seal of law, it becomes far harder to challenge. Passes into history as fact. It shapes memory. It teaches future generations what is permissible when authority feels threatened. The trial that was never truly a trial ended not with clarity, but with silence. The order vanished. The questions remained. And perhaps that is the most enduring legacy of this moment. Not what was decided, but what was never allowed to be asked. On a cold evening in March 1314, the long campaign against the Knights Templar reached its final, irreversible moment. The island in the Seine was quiet, the air heavy with damp and smoke. Crowds gathered not in celebration, but in uneasy silence. They had come to witness the end of a man who, for decades, had embodied one of the most powerful institutions in Christendom. Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, was brought forward in chains. He was no young revolutionary. He was an old soldier, a man shaped by discipline, routine, and faith. He had spent his life within the order, rising slowly through its ranks, guided by obedience rather than ambition. When he became Grand Master, the Templars were already under strain. The Holy Land was slipping away. Their purpose was being questioned. But Jacques de Molay believed, stubbornly and sincerely, that loyalty to the Church would preserve them. That belief had brought him here. For 7 years, he had endured imprisonment, interrogation, and humiliation. He had confessed under pressure, then recanted. He had tried to navigate an impossible path between survival and truth. Each attempt had only tightened the net around him. Now, stripped of rank and dignity, he stood before a platform erected for public execution. He was not alone. Beside him stood Geoffroy de Charny, another senior Templar, condemned alongside him. Both men had been sentenced not to death by fire, but to life imprisonment until they spoke. The Church had expected compliance, a final confession, a quiet submission that would close the matter cleanly. Instead, Jacques de Molay did something unexpected. As the sentence was read aloud, he stepped forward and spoke. His voice, according to chroniclers, was calm, not defiant, not desperate, clear. He declared that the order was innocent, that the confessions had been lies forced by suffering, that the charges of heresy were false, that the Templars had served Christ faithfully until the end. With those words, he sealed his fate. In medieval law, to recant a confession after conviction was to admit relapse into heresy. There was no appeal, no delay. The sentence was changed on the spot. Jacques de Molay and Geoffroy de Charny were condemned to death by burning. The speed of the decision stunned the crowd. This was not planned. It was reaction. authority asserting itself in the face of unexpected truth. They were led immediately to the pyre. As the fire was prepared, Jacques de Molay asked for one final request. He asked to face Notre Dame Cathedral, to face the symbol of the faith he was accused of betraying. The request was granted. Flames rose as dusk deepened. Smoke curled into the sky, and as the fire took hold, Jacques de Molay spoke again. What he said next would echo through history, blurring the line between record and legend. According to later accounts, he called upon God to judge those who had wronged the Templars. He named Pope Clement V. He named King Philip IV. He declared that both would be summoned before divine justice within the year. Whether these words were recorded precisely or reshaped by memory is impossible to know. Medieval chroniclers were not neutral observers. They understood the power of narrative. Still, the timing that followed gave the story extraordinary weight. Pope Clement V died just weeks later, struck by sudden illness. King Philip IV died before the year was out, his body broken after a hunting accident. To a medieval audience, this sequence felt unmistakable. Divine judgment had been delivered. The curse of Jacques de Molay entered legend. But beyond the drama of prophecy lies something more human and more tragic. Jacques de Molay did not die cursing the church. He died reaffirming faith. His final words were not rebellion, but testimony. He chose death over silence, knowing exactly what it would cost him. This decision transformed him. In life, he had been cautious, even hesitant. In death, he became resolute. The man who had once trusted institutions to protect him now placed his trust elsewhere. Fire does strange things to memory. It erases bodies, but it sharpens stories. The image of the Grand Master burning while proclaiming innocence proved impossible to forget. It complicated the official narrative. Heretics were supposed to beg, to plead, to rage. Jacques de Molay did none of these. He bore witness. The execution unsettled those who watched it. Chroniclers noted the crowd's reaction. Not triumph, but discomfort. Something about the scene did not fit. The man burning before them did not look like a monster. He looked like a martyr. The church had wanted closure. Instead, it created a symbol. From that moment on, the destruction of the Templars was no longer a clean administrative act. It was stained by doubt. Jacques de Molay's death forced a question that could not be answered by decrees or trials. If the order was truly heretical, why did its leader die proclaiming innocence with such composure? If the confessions were true, why retract them at the cost of life itself? The execution did not silence the story. It amplified it. In the years that followed, Jacques de Molay became a figure of quiet resistance. Not through rebellion, but through memory. His death marked the point at which the Templar story passed from legal record into legend. Legends do not survive because they are accurate. They survive because they resonate. The curse, whether real or embellished, gave the fall of the Templars a moral shape. It suggested that power, though victorious in the moment, could still be judged by forces beyond its control. It offered a sense of balance in a story otherwise defined by injustice. For many, Jacques de Molay became a symbol of betrayed faith. Faith not in God, but in institutions that claimed to represent him. His execution revealed the cost of obedience when authority abandons responsibility. And yet, there is another layer to his final act. By speaking when silence would have saved him, Jacques de Molay ensured that the official version of history would never stand alone. He planted doubt at the very end of the narrative. Doubt that would survive long after documents were sealed and properties redistributed. He did not save the order, but he saved its question. Was the destruction of the Templars truly about heresy? Or was it about power, fear, and control? That question lingered like smoke over the Seine. In death, Jacques de Molay achieved what he could not in life. He made it impossible to forget that the Templars did not disappear quietly. They were extinguished in public, under scrutiny, and with words that refused to align with their condemnation. The fire consumed his body. It did not consume his testimony. And so the story of the Knights Templar did not end with their dissolution. It ended with a man standing in flames, facing the heart of Christendom, and choosing truth over survival. History would spend the next 7 centuries trying to decide what that choice truly meant. With the order dissolved, its leaders executed or imprisoned, and its reputation shattered, one question refused to disappear. It was whispered in taverns, debated in courts, and recorded cautiously by chroniclers who sensed the danger of asking too loudly. If the Knights Templar were so wealthy, so powerful, so deeply embedded in the financial life of Europe, where did it all go? According to official accounts, the answer was simple. The order's assets were seized and transferred, largely to the Knights Hospitaller. Lands, buildings, revenues, and movable goods were catalogued and redistributed under papal authority. On parchment, the process appeared orderly and complete. In reality, it was anything but. The sheer scale of Templar wealth made total seizure implausible. The order operated across dozens of kingdoms and regions, each with its own laws, rivalries, and degrees of compliance. Some rulers eagerly confiscated properties. Others delayed. Some quietly absorbed assets for themselves. Others claimed ignorance. But even accounting for corruption and inefficiency, something did not add up. The Templars had not only land and buildings. They held liquid wealth, coin, bullion, deposits entrusted to them for safekeeping. Kings had stored treasuries in Templar vaults. Nobles had left fortunes in their care. Merchants had relied on their system to move money across borders. When the arrests came, these systems did not simply vanish. They were disrupted, but disruption creates opportunity. In Paris, royal officials moved quickly to seize the temple complex. They expected to find vast treasure. What they found instead was modest. Records existed, but much of the wealth they anticipated was missing. This absence immediately fueled speculation. Some argued the order had been declining financially. The loss of the Holy Land had been costly. Wars had drained resources. But this explanation rang hollow. Even diminished, the Templars should have possessed far more than what was recovered. Others suggested the wealth had been moved in advance. The arrests were sudden, but not entirely unforeseeable. Rumors of investigation had circulated for months. Some Templars may have sensed danger. As disciplined administrators, they understood contingency. It is not unreasonable to believe that assets were quietly relocated, accounts closed, or valuables transferred to trusted hands. There are tantalizing hints of such movements. On the eve of the arrests, reports emerged of Templar ships leaving French ports under cover of darkness. Their destinations were not recorded. Some legends claim they sailed to Scotland, others to Portugal, others still to more distant shores. These stories are difficult to verify, but their persistence suggests something extraordinary occurred. Even within France, local officials complained of incomplete inventories. Documents referenced properties that could not be located. Funds listed in ledgers were no longer present. The explanation was never fully clarified. This uncertainty became fertile ground for myth. Over time, the missing treasure grew in imagination. It became gold chests buried beneath ruins, sacred relics hidden in forests, secret vaults sealed forever. Later centuries would attach the Holy Grail, the Ark of the Covenant, and other legendary objects to the story. These embellishments obscure a more mundane but equally troubling reality. The Templars' greatest treasure may not have been physical at all. Their true wealth lay in information. They possessed records of debts, obligations, and transactions that connected Europe's elite. They knew who owed whom. They understood the financial vulnerabilities of kings and nobles. This knowledge alone was dangerous. If such records were destroyed, hidden, or selectively released, they could reshape power without a single coin changing hands. The disappearance of Templar archives is almost as striking as the disappearance of their gold. Few internal documents survive. Account books, correspondence, and operational manuals are largely absent from historical record. This absence is not accidental. Someone, somewhere, ensured these materials did not endure. Perhaps they were destroyed to erase influence. Perhaps they were hidden to preserve it. Either possibility is unsettling. In some regions, former Templars were absorbed into other orders. In others, they lived quietly under supervision. A small number vanished entirely. These men would have carried knowledge of routes, networks, and trust relationships built over decades. Networks do not disappear overnight. They adapt. Consider Portugal, where King Dinis resisted the full suppression of the Templars. Instead of confiscating assets outright, he reconstituted the order under a new name, the Order of Christ. Many former Templars joined it. Properties were retained. Functions continued, subtly transformed. This continuity suggests that at least some Templar wealth and expertise survived intact. In Scotland, where royal authority was weakened and relations with the papacy strained, enforcement of the dissolution was inconsistent. Some Templars may have found refuge there. Legends link them to later military victories and secret brotherhoods. While such claims are often exaggerated, they reflect a broader truth. Suppression was uneven. Where authority fractured, survival was possible. The Church maintained that all legitimate assets were transferred properly. But legitimacy is a matter of perspective. Local rulers often interpreted papal directives in ways that benefited themselves. Confiscation blurred into appropriation. Redistribution blurred into theft. In this chaos, wealth scattered. Some of it likely ended up in royal treasuries, quietly absorbed and never acknowledged. Some may have funded other orders. Some may have been lost entirely, and some undoubtedly was concealed. The idea that the Templars hid treasure before their fall is not inherently fantastical. It is practical. Institutions facing existential threat often safeguard resources for uncertain futures. The Templars were no exception. What makes the question enduring is not the amount of treasure, but the implications of its disappearance. If the order had been truly corrupt, greedy, and self-serving, one might expect chaos, betrayal, and panic. Instead, the evidence suggests discipline until the end. Assets did not surface in the hands of rogue members. There was no wave of sudden wealth among former Templars. This restraint points to collective action. Whether through loyalty, fear, or foresight, the order appears to have protected something beyond immediate survival. They did not scatter riches to individuals. If they hid wealth, it was done methodically. And that raises another question. To what end? If the Templars intended to restore the order, hidden treasure might have served as seed capital. But no such restoration occurred openly. If they intended to preserve knowledge or influence, wealth could support that quietly. Or perhaps the treasure was never meant to be recovered. Perhaps it was a final act of defiance, denying their enemies the spoils of destruction. In that interpretation, the vanishing treasure becomes symbolic. Not a hoard waiting to be found, but a statement. Power does not always pass cleanly from victor to vanquished. The Church and the Crown may have destroyed the order, but they did not inherit all that it was. The mystery of the Templar treasure endures because it mirrors a deeper uncertainty. History records what is seized, redistributed, and declared. It struggles to record what is withheld. Gold can be melted. Documents can be burned. Networks can dissolve into anonymity. What remains is speculation and unease. Because if the Templars were capable of hiding their wealth so effectively, what else might they have preserved beyond the reach of authority? The disappearance of their treasure is not merely a question of missing gold. It is a reminder that power, once dispersed, does not always leave a trace. And in that silence, imagination rushes to fill the void. Perhaps that is why the question persists. Not because we expect to find chests buried beneath ruined chapels, but because the idea of something slipping free from total control is profoundly unsettling. The Templars were meant to vanish completely. Their wealth was meant to legitimize their destruction. Its absence undermines that narrative. It suggests that even in defeat, something escaped. And whatever escaped has haunted history ever since. When an institution as large and disciplined as the Knights Templar is destroyed, it is tempting to imagine a clean ending. Orders are given. Buildings are seized. Leaders are executed. History closes the book. Yet real endings are rarely so tidy. Beneath the official narrative of dissolution lies a quieter, more unsettling possibility, that the Templars did not vanish, but adapted. After the order was formally dissolved, thousands of men were suddenly left without identity. They were no longer knights, no longer brothers, no longer protected by vows or papal authority. Some were imprisoned. Some were absorbed into other religious houses. Some were pensioned off and told to live quietly. And some simply disappeared from the record altogether. This disappearance is where certainty ends and survival begins. Not all regions enforced the suppression with equal zeal. France, under the watchful eye of King Philip, was ruthless. Elsewhere, compliance was slower, reluctant, or incomplete. The medieval world was fragmented. Papal authority weakened as distance increased. Local rulers interpreted directives according to their own interests. In these gaps, survival was possible. Many Templars were not criminals hiding from justice. They were trained administrators, engineers, warriors, and financiers. They possessed skills in high demand. In a world constantly threatened by war and instability, such men were valuable. Quietly, they were taken in. Some joined other orders, particularly the Hospitallers, who absorbed large numbers of former Templars along with their properties. Officially, this was a transfer of assets and personnel. Unofficially, it was continuity under another name. Brothers who had once worn the Red Cross now served under a different banner, carrying with them habits, knowledge, and memories. Others returned to secular life. This transition was not simple. Templars had taken vows that separated them from family and inheritance. Many had entered the order as young men, leaving behind identities they could no longer reclaim. To survive, they had to reinvent themselves. They became estate managers, mercenaries, advisors. Some disappeared into rural obscurity. Others entered royal service under assumed anonymity. Records from the period are sparse, but occasional references hint at former Templars appearing in unexpected places, years after the order's supposed end. Then there are the regions where suppression was weakest. Portugal stands out. King Dinis resisted the wholesale destruction of the order, recognizing both its value and its injustice. Rather than dissolve the Templars entirely, he reorganized them. The Order of Christ inherited their properties, members, and much of their structure. Officially, this was a new institution. In practice, it was the Templars reborn. This survival had long-term consequences. Centuries later, the Order of Christ would play a central role in Portugal's age of exploration, funding voyages that reshaped the world. The Red Cross, slightly altered, would appear on the sails of ships heading into the unknown. Continuity, not extinction. In Scotland, the situation was different but equally telling. The country was under excommunication at the time of the Templar suppression due to its conflict with England. Papal authority held little sway. Enforcement of the dissolution was inconsistent at best. Later legends claim Templars fought alongside Robert the Bruce at Bannockburn. These stories are impossible to prove and likely embellished. But their persistence suggests something deeper. The idea that displaced knights found refuge where authority was weakest. Even without legends, logic supports the possibility. Scotland needed experienced fighters. Former Templars needed protection. Mutual benefit requires no conspiracy. Beyond Europe, some speculate that Templars traveled farther still. To the Iberian frontier, to the Baltic, even to lands beyond Christendom. These claims drift toward myth, yet they echo a broader truth. Mobility was one of the order's defining strengths. They were accustomed to travel, to operating in hostile environments, to building networks from nothing. If any medieval group could dissolve into anonymity and survive, it was the Templars. What makes this survival especially intriguing is its silence. There was no attempt to publicly restore the order. No uprising. No manifesto. This restraint suggests intention. Survival was not about reclaiming power. It was about avoiding annihilation. Silence became strategy. Those who survived would have understood the danger of memory. To speak openly of the past was to invite suspicion. To claim Templar identity was to risk persecution. Better to let the order die in name while its people lived on quietly. This form of survival leaves few traces. It resists documentation. It frustrates historians. And yet, patterns remain. Templar architectural styles appear in unexpected places after the dissolution. Administrative practices persist. Financial methods continue under new authorities. These are not proofs but echoes. The Church preferred to believe the Templars were gone. Kings preferred closure. Both benefited from the illusion of finality. Questioning it reopened wounds best left sealed. But history rarely cooperates with comfort. The idea that the Templars survived in silence challenges the narrative of total control. It suggests that even when institutions collapse, people endure. They adapt, merge, and carry fragments of the past forward. This endurance also reframes the accusations of secrecy. Perhaps the Templars did not hide because they were guilty, but because they understood how power operates. They knew that survival required invisibility. If so, their final lesson was learned too late to save the order, but not too late to save its members. Survival in silence does not produce heroes. Produces shadows. Men who lived with the knowledge that their past could never be spoken aloud. That their sacrifices would never be acknowledged. That their story would be told by others, often falsely. This is a quiet tragedy. The Templars who survived did not pass down grand truths or secret doctrines openly. They passed down habits, skills, ways of thinking. These are harder to erase. Over generations, memory blurred. Identity softened. What remained was influence without attribution. Perhaps this is why the Templars continue to haunt history. Not because they left behind hidden treasure or secret relics, but because they represent something unresolved. A challenge to the idea that authority can fully erase what it condemns. The Church dissolved the order. The Crown seized its assets. But neither could fully extinguish the people who had made it real. In that sense, the Templars did not end at the stake or in the prison cell. They ended gradually, quietly, blending into the world they once served from the margins. Their survival was not dramatic. It was human, and that may be the most unsettling possibility of all. Because it means the Templars were not merely victims of history. They were participants in its continuation, silent witnesses to their own erasure, carrying forward what could not be destroyed by decree. The order died. The men endured. And in their endurance, they left behind a question that still lingers. How many other histories have ended not with a full stop, but with an ellipsis we never noticed? As the dust settled across much of Europe, the disappearance of the Knights Templar began to look less like an ending and more like a transformation. In certain regions, the suppression did not erase the order so much as redirect it. Old structures were dismantled on paper, yet something unmistakably familiar continued beneath new names and banners. Nowhere was this more apparent than in places where political necessity outweighed obedience to Rome. Portugal was the clearest example. King Dinis understood what others pretended not to see. The Templars were not simply monks with swords. They were administrators, builders, navigators, and guardians of frontier lands. Portugal, still defining itself against both Muslim territories and rival Christian kingdoms, could not afford to lose such an asset. Rather than confiscate and destroy, Dinis negotiated. The Templar properties were not seized outright. Their members were not scattered. Instead, the order was reborn in 1319 as the Order of Christ, sanctioned by the papacy but unmistakably Templar in spirit. Former Templars filled its ranks. The organizational structure remained intact. The Red Cross was retained, subtly altered. Officially, the Templars were gone. Functionally, they endured. This was not defiance. It was pragmatism. By reframing the order, Portugal satisfied papal demands while preserving invaluable expertise. The Church, eager to maintain influence, accepted the compromise. The consequences would ripple through history. 2 centuries later, the Order of Christ funded and guided Portugal's great age of exploration. Ships bearing its cross sailed beyond the known world. Navigators trained under its patronage mapped coastlines and sea routes previously unimagined. Knowledge flowed outward, reshaping global history. It is difficult not to see continuity here. The skills that enabled the Templars to manage far-flung commanderies, logistics, navigation, finance, were the same skills required to launch oceanic exploration. What the order had once done across continents, it now did across oceans. Portugal preserved not just men and land, but institutional memory. Scotland presents a different, more ambiguous case. At the time of the Templar suppression, Scotland existed on the margins of papal authority. Locked in conflict with England and excommunicated, the Scottish crown was under little obligation to enforce Rome's decrees. Records from this period are fragmentary, but they reveal uneven compliance. Some Templar properties were absorbed quietly into local estates. Some brothers disappeared into rural life, and some, according to later tradition, found protection under Robert the Bruce. The famous story of Templars fighting at Bannockburn is almost certainly embellished. Yet myths rarely emerge without a seed of plausibility. Scotland needed experienced fighters. Former Templars needed refuge. The arrangement would have benefited both. More importantly, Scotland offered distance. Distance from French authority, distance from inquisitors, distance from scrutiny. It was a place where silence could be maintained. Whether or not organized survival occurred, the perception that it might have is revealing. It reflects a broader truth. The Templars were not uniformly destroyed. Their fate depended heavily on geography and politics. Elsewhere, similar patterns emerge. In Spain, enforcement varied between kingdoms. In Aragon and Castile, Templar lands were contested, delayed, and sometimes reassigned in ways that preserved local networks. In the Holy Roman Empire, the decentralized nature of authority allowed former Templars to blend into other knightly orders or secular roles with relative ease. Across Europe, the dissolution fractured into dozens of local outcomes rather than one uniform conclusion. This fragmentation created space for what later generations would call shadow orders. These were not secret cults meeting in darkness, but quiet continuities, brotherhoods, guilds, and institutions that absorbed Templar methods without inheriting their name. Military orders restructured. Financial practices persisted. Symbols reappeared in altered forms. Over time, memory blurred. By the late medieval period, stories began to surface of hidden lineages, of ancient knowledge passed quietly from one group to another. These stories grew richer in the Renaissance and exploded in the modern era, fueled by fascination with secrecy and forbidden truth. Many of these claims are exaggerated. Some are entirely fictional, but they are built on a real foundation. The Templars did not vanish completely, and their absence created uncertainty. Uncertainty invites myth. The Church itself contributed to this ambiguity. By dissolving the order without a definitive verdict of heresy, it left room for doubt. The official explanation, that the Templars were suppressed for the sake of peace, not because their guilt was proven, was legally precise but emotionally unsatisfying. People sensed something unresolved. In that unresolved space, successor orders and quiet continuities flourished. The Order of Christ was merely the most visible. Others existed in subtler forms, woven into the fabric of local power rather than standing apart from it. What ties these threads together is not conspiracy, but adaptation. The Templars had always been flexible. They operated across cultures, languages, and political systems. Their survival strategies did not require secret meetings or coded messages. They required patience, discretion, and the willingness to let identity dissolve. To survive, the order had to die. This paradox lies at the heart of the Templar legacy. The more thoroughly the name was erased, the more effectively its influence endured. Later secret societies would claim descent from the Templars, often without evidence. Freemasons, Rosicrucians, and various esoteric movements adopted Templar imagery, projecting their own ideals backward. These claims tell us more about modern longing than medieval reality. Yet even these appropriations point to something genuine, the sense that the Templars represented a form of knowledge and organization that slipped through the grasp of authority. Whether that knowledge was practical, symbolic, or spiritual matters less than the perception that it existed. In Portugal, that perception became history. In Scotland, it became legend. Elsewhere, it faded into habit. Taken together, these outcomes challenge the notion of total suppression. They suggest that the Church and Crown succeeded in destroying the Templars as an institution, but not as an idea. Ideas are harder to kill. The Templars had embodied the possibility of an order that transcended borders, blended faith with reason, and operated beyond the control of any single power. That possibility did not die with them. It simply changed shape. Shadow orders do not announce themselves. They are recognized only in hindsight, through patterns and continuities that resist simple explanation. The question, then, is not whether the Templars survived intact. They did not. The question is whether their way of operating, their emphasis on discipline, networked power, and quiet autonomy, continued to influence the world. The evidence suggests it did. And that influence complicates the Church's attempt at closure. By suppressing the Templars without fully erasing their methods, the Church inadvertently allowed those methods to disperse. Instead of one powerful order, fragments were scattered across Europe, embedded in new contexts, harder to identify and harder to control. In seeking to eliminate a threat, authority multiplied it. This may be the final irony of the Templar story. They were destroyed because they were too independent. And in destruction, their independence became permanent. No banner remained to rally around. No headquarters to seize. Only traces, quiet, adaptable, and enduring. The shadow orders, real or imagined, reflect a deeper truth. When power suppresses without understanding, what survives is not obedience, but memory reshaped into resilience. And in that resilience, the Knights Templar continue to exist, not as an order, but as a question history has never fully answered. Long after the fires burned out and the last of the Knights Templar vanished from public life, one place remained stubbornly silent. Its walls were thick, its doors were sealed, and behind them lay the paper trail of one of the most controversial suppressions in Christian history. The Vatican Archives, now called the Vatican Apostolic Archive, became the final guardian of what the Church chose to remember, and what it chose to forget. For centuries, historians suspected that crucial documents related to the Templars were hidden there. Papal correspondence, internal reports, records of interrogations never meant for royal eyes. But suspicion alone could not pierce locked doors. The Church insisted that the matter was settled, the records routine, the past closed. Yet archives do not exist to preserve comfort. They exist to preserve truth, sometimes inconvenient, sometimes dangerous. Access to the Vatican archives was tightly controlled for most of their history. Scholars required special permission. Entire sections remained off-limits. Catalogs were incomplete. Files were mislabeled or buried deep within unrelated collections. This was not unusual for a medieval archive. But in the case of the Templars, the absence felt deliberate. The Church had a reason to be cautious. The official narrative held that the order was dissolved not because its guilt was proven, but because it had become too scandalized to survive. This distinction allowed the Church to avoid admitting error while still cooperating with royal demands. But such a delicate position could not withstand scrutiny if internal documents told a different story. And for a long time, no one could check. Then, in the early 21st century, something changed. In 2001, a historian named Barbara Frail was researching unrelated materials when she stumbled upon a parchment misfiled in the Vatican archives. It was damaged, incomplete, and largely ignored. Yet what it contained would alter centuries of assumption. The document became known as the Chinon parchment. Dated to 1308, it recorded a papal inquiry conducted by representatives of Pope Clement V himself. The inquiry took place at Chinon, where high-ranking Templars, including Jacques de Molay, were held. Crucially, it documented that the Pope had absolved them of heresy after hearing their testimony. Absolved. This did not mean the Pope believed them innocent of all wrongdoing, but it meant he did not consider them heretics. The central charge used to justify their destruction had been quietly dismissed, years before the order was officially dissolved. The implications were staggering. If the Pope had absolved the Templars, why were they still destroyed? Why was this absolution never made public? Why were men executed years later for crimes they had already been forgiven? The answer lies not in theology, but in power. The Chinon parchment revealed what many had long suspected. The papacy knew the accusations were flawed. Clement V understood that confessions were unreliable. He recognized that heresy had not been proven. Yet he chose not to challenge the king publicly. The document was never intended for royal eyes. It was internal, confidential, a record of conscience rather than policy. And it was buried. For centuries, the existence of such a document was unknown. The Church never referenced it. Historians debated endlessly whether the Pope truly believed the Templars guilty or merely capitulated under pressure. The Chinon parchment answered that question decisively. He knew. This discovery did not come alone. Other documents surfaced, letters expressing concern about torture, reports questioning the validity of confessions, correspondence revealing Clement's hesitation and fear of political fallout. Taken together, they paint a picture very different from the official story. The Church was not convinced of the Templars' guilt. It was trapped. The Vatican archives thus reveal a truth more unsettling than outright condemnation. Moral compromise. The Church chose institutional survival over justice, knowing full well the cost. This raises a deeper question. If such a critical document could remain hidden for 700 years, what else lies buried? The Vatican archives contain miles of shelving, millions of documents. Many remain uncatalogued or only partially studied. Scholars work within limits, time, access, language, and permission. Every discovery raises the possibility that others await. The Church maintains that nothing of comparable significance remains concealed, that transparency has improved, that history has been open to scrutiny. Yet the very existence of the Chinon parchment undermines that assurance. It was not destroyed. It was not lost. It was simply filed away out of sight, where it could not disrupt the narrative. Silence, again, proved more effective than lies. The release of the Chinon parchment forced the Church to respond. In 2007, the Vatican published it officially, acknowledging its contents. The announcement was cautious, almost understated. There was no apology, no admission of wrongdoing, just a statement of historical fact. But facts have consequences. The document confirmed that the Templars were not condemned for heresy by the Pope. It reframed their destruction as a political act tolerated by the Church, not a spiritual judgment driven by truth. This distinction matters. It means the Church did not destroy the Templars because they were enemies of God. It allowed their destruction because resisting would have threatened its own position. For believers, this realization is deeply unsettling. It challenges the idea of moral authority acting as a safeguard against injustice. It forces a reckoning with the limits of institutional conscience. For historians, it validates centuries of doubt. And for the story of the Templars, it restores complexity. They were not saints. They were not demons. They were an order caught between competing powers, sacrificed to preserve an uneasy balance. The locked archives tell us something else as well. History is not just what happened. It is what was recorded, preserved, and revealed, often long after those involved were gone. The Church controlled the narrative by controlling access to memory. When that control weakens, new interpretations emerge. The Chinon parchment does not exonerate the Templars completely, but it dismantles the justification for their annihilation. It shows that the central charge, heresy, was known to be unsustainable. What followed was not justice. It was expedience. This realization reframes the entire story. The question is no longer, what did the Templars hide? It becomes, what did the Church choose not to say? And that question does not end with the Templars. If one order could be sacrificed quietly, absolved in secret and condemned in public, how many other moments in history follow the same pattern? How many truths lie dormant, waiting for chance discovery? The Vatican archives stand as both a promise and a warning. They promise that history can still surprise us, that lost voices can still be heard, that silence is not always permanent. But they also warn us that institutions shape memory to serve survival, that moral clarity is often compromised behind closed doors, that what we accept as settled history may be only the surface of a much deeper story. In the case of the Knights Templar, the locked archives did not protect truth. They postponed it. 7 centuries later, the truth did not emerge with a dramatic proclamation. It slipped out quietly on a misfiled parchment, read by a patient historian. And with it came an uncomfortable realization. The Church did not destroy the Templars because it believed them guilty. It destroyed them because it believed resistance was too costly. Once that door is opened, history looks very different. And the silence of the archives becomes as telling as the words they finally release. When the Knights Templar vanished from the public stage, Europe did not suddenly become a simpler place. Power shifted, institutions adapted, and ideas continued to move, often along the same hidden pathways the Templars themselves had once used. If the order truly disappeared, its influence did not. Instead, it resurfaced in subtler forms, woven into the foundations of a world that was quietly changing. The 14th and 15th centuries were a time of transition. Medieval certainty began to fracture. The authority of the Church, once nearly absolute, was increasingly questioned. Monarchs centralized power. Trade expanded beyond local markets. Knowledge long suppressed or forgotten began to reemerge. This was not a sudden revolution, but a gradual awakening, and it did not happen in isolation. The Templars had existed at the intersection of faith, finance, and global contact. Long before the Renaissance, they had operated networks that ignored borders, facilitated exchange, and valued practical knowledge. When the order was destroyed, those systems did not evaporate. They were absorbed. Banking is one of the clearest examples. The financial practices pioneered and refined by the Templars, letters of credit, secure transfers, standardized accounting, did not disappear with them. Italian banking families expanded and formalized similar systems in the decades that followed. Whether directly influenced by former Templar methods or simply building upon the same necessities, the continuity is striking. Money became abstract. Wealth was no longer defined solely by land or coin, but by trust, records, and promises. This shift reshaped economies and, eventually, political power. Kings who once depended on physical treasure now relied on credit. Institutions rose that could challenge crowns without armies. This transformation mirrored the world the Templars had already inhabited. The spread of knowledge followed a similar pattern. Texts preserved in the Islamic world began to circulate more widely in Europe. Philosophy, science, and medicine experienced a revival that would later be called the Renaissance. Scholars questioned ancient authorities. Observation began to rival tradition. The Church struggled to contain this shift. The Templars had been exposed to these currents centuries earlier. They had encountered cultures where scholarship was prized and inquiry encouraged. They had witnessed forms of learning that coexisted with faith rather than opposing it. Even if they did not articulate a new philosophy, they embodied a way of operating that valued adaptability and knowledge. After their fall, that way of operating did not vanish. It became less visible, diffused across institutions that no longer bore their name. Consider the rise of centralized states. The Templars had functioned as an international organization long before such structures were common. They managed assets across regions, enforced internal discipline, and operated under a unified rule. In many ways, they anticipated modern bureaucratic institutions. As monarchs consolidated power, they adopted similar methods. Standardized administration, professional armies, centralized finance. These developments were often framed as innovations, but they echoed models already tested by orders like the Templars. In this sense, the Templars were not relics of a dying medieval world. They were early expressions of a new one. Their destruction did not halt this evolution. It accelerated it. By eliminating a powerful intermediary between church and state, the suppression of the Templars cleared space for secular authority to expand. Kings learned that religious institutions could be subdued. The papacy learned that compromise was sometimes necessary for survival. This recalibration of power set the stage for later conflicts and reforms. The Protestant Reformation did not emerge directly from the Templar story, but it inherited its lessons. Trust in institutions eroded. Appeals to conscience gained weight. The idea that authority could be wrong, and that obedience was not always virtuous, took root. These ideas did not appear from nowhere. They grew in soil fertilized by centuries of contradiction, betrayal, and suppressed truth. The Templars' fate became part of that soil, even if unspoken. Their story circulated in fragments, legends of injustice, whispered doubts about official narratives, fascination with secrecy and lost knowledge. Such stories resonated because they aligned with lived experience. People had seen powerful institutions act unjustly. They had seen faith used to justify violence. The Templars became a symbol of this tension, not as saints or rebels but as a warning, a reminder that devotion does not guarantee protection, and that power often cloaks itself in righteousness. This symbolism influenced later movements that emphasized inner belief over external authority. Mystical traditions flourished. Esoteric interpretations of Christianity gained followers. The idea that truth might be accessed personally, rather than mediated exclusively by institutions, gained traction. Again, this does not mean the Templars consciously planted these ideas, but their suppression demonstrated the consequences of challenging, or merely complicating, orthodoxy. In science, too, the pattern repeats. The Renaissance emphasis on observation, experimentation, and empirical evidence reflected a shift away from unquestioned authority. Scholars who challenged accepted wisdom often faced resistance, even persecution. The memory of the Templars lingered as a cautionary tale. Knowledge could be dangerous, and yet it persisted. The same tension that destroyed the Templars, the clash between control and inquiry, continued to shape modern thought. Each time authority suppressed dissent, it reinforced the perception that truth lay beyond official boundaries. This dynamic fueled progress as much as it fueled conflict. Even the modern concept of secrecy owes something to the Templar legacy. Before their fall, secrecy had been associated with discipline and security. Afterward, it became associated with suspicion and power. Secret societies, real or imagined, fascinated the public imagination. They promised hidden truths beyond institutional reach. Many of these societies claimed Templar ancestry without evidence. But the appeal of that claim reveals something important. The Templars came to represent the idea of knowledge denied, of truth suppressed by authority. That idea became a powerful engine for modern skepticism. By the time the Enlightenment arrived, Europe was primed to question. Thinkers challenged monarchy, church, and tradition. Reason was elevated. Individual conscience gained legitimacy. The long shadow of institutional betrayal stretched behind these developments. The Templars were not the cause. They were a chapter that illustrated how systems react when they feel threatened, and how those reactions can backfire. In destroying the Templars, the church and crown sought stability. Instead, they demonstrated fragility. They revealed that authority depended on compliance, not inherent truth. Once that realization took hold, it could not be undone. Modernity emerged not from harmony, but from rupture. The Templars' destruction was one such rupture, quiet in its immediate aftermath, but resonant over time. It taught future generations that history is shaped not only by victories, but by silenced failures. Their legacy is not a secret doctrine or lost treasure. It is a pattern, an enduring reminder that when institutions suppress complexity in favor of control, they sow the seeds of their own transformation. The modern world, with its skepticism, its systems of finance, its global networks, and its uneasy relationship with authority, reflects this inheritance. The Templars did not build modernity, but they stood at its threshold. Their rise showed what was possible when faith, organization, and knowledge aligned. Their fall showed what happened when that alignment threatened established power. Between those two moments lies the story of a world learning, slowly and painfully, that truth cannot be owned, and that suppressing it only ensures its return in another form. In that sense, the Knights Templar never truly disappeared. They became part of the foundation on which modern thought was built, not as heroes or villains, but as a lesson written into history itself. A lesson that continues to unfold. Even as the centuries passed, the story of the Knights Templar remained a haunting presence, refusing to settle into tidy historical footnotes. Their disappearance from official records, their sudden vilification, and the enduring mystery surrounding their wealth and knowledge combined to create an aura that was impossible to ignore. Across Europe and later across the world, the Templars evolved from a tangible order into a symbol, a mirror reflecting both fear and fascination, authority and rebellion. By the late medieval period, the Templars had become more myth than reality, yet their influence lingered in subtle ways. Scholars, merchants, and rulers continued to operate within systems the Templars had once mastered: networked communication, international finance, fortified infrastructure, and disciplined administration. These methods, once the practical backbone of an order devoted to both faith and action, now informed secular and ecclesiastical structures alike, often without acknowledgement. Legends began to fill the gaps left by official silence. Tales of hidden treasure, secret rituals, and surviving Templars circulated in whispers, often in regions where enforcement of the order's suppression had been weak or uneven. In Portugal, Scotland, and parts of the Iberian frontier, former Templars quietly assumed roles that leveraged their expertise in ways that were invisible to the larger world. They became advisors, mercenaries, financiers, and administrators, carrying fragments of knowledge that had been honed over decades of international operation. The stories of Templar survival fed an imagination already attuned to secrecy. Minstrels and chroniclers embellished tales of the order's hidden riches. Poets imagined the Red Cross Knights wandering the wilderness or guarding sacred relics. Local legends conflated Templar skill with mysticism, casting the order as a repository of knowledge too powerful to be extinguished entirely. Each retelling altered perception, shaping an enduring narrative that was simultaneously fearful, romantic, and reverent. This evolution from fact to myth illustrates a central tension. The Templars' legacy was not only the order's tangible accomplishments but the reaction they provoked in the societies they had served and challenged. Power, when exercised independently of both crown and church, inspires anxiety. The Templars' autonomy, their wealth, and their discipline had made them indispensable and dangerous. The public mythos that grew around them was, in part, a projection of that fear. Stories amplified the sense that a secret order had operated beyond accountability and could not be entirely controlled, even in defeat. By the early modern period, fascination with the Templars had spread to new intellectual and cultural contexts. Renaissance humanists, exploring the recovered wisdom of the classical and Islamic worlds, encountered references to the Templars' organizational skill and scholarly interests. Even without direct evidence, the idea of an order that bridged practical action with intellectual sophistication inspired reflection on authority, secrecy, and knowledge. In an age increasingly skeptical of unchallenged power, the Templars offered both a cautionary tale and a model of disciplined excellence. At the same time, secret societies began to claim or imagine connections to the Templars, further reinforcing their symbolic power. Organizations like the Freemasons and Rosicrucians, though centuries removed and often unconnected by direct lineage, adopted Templar imagery, rituals, and motifs. The order's visual symbols, the red cross, the sword, the knightly mantle, became shorthand for an ideal of disciplined knowledge combined with moral purpose. Legends of lost treasure, hidden initiation rites, and cryptic symbols were appropriated to lend legitimacy to entirely new forms of association. In this sense, the Templars survived less as individuals and more as an idea. They embodied the possibility of disciplined autonomy, a force capable of operating effectively across borders, managing vast resources, and navigating both political and spiritual obligations. Their dissolution removed the physical institution, but the principles underlying its operation persisted in forms that authorities could not entirely suppress. Knowledge, skill, and method proved more resilient than name or office. The Templars' enduring mystique also reflects the human need to confront ambiguity. History often seeks to categorize actors as wholly virtuous or wholly corrupt. The Templars defied this simplicity. They were soldiers and monks, wealthy and ascetic, powerful and obedient, disciplined and autonomous. Their complexity made them difficult to understand in their own time and impossible to simplify in later imagination. The absence of clear records, particularly following the suppression and the controlled handling of archives, created fertile ground for speculation. Every unanswered question, whether about their rituals, Their wealth, or the reasons for their downfall, magnified their symbolic power. Cultural memory transformed them into archetypes. The idea of the Templar became a symbol of institutional betrayal, of the consequences of power that challenges authority, and of the resilience of disciplined purpose. Artists, writers, and thinkers depicted them as both villains and heroes, their story adapted to reflect contemporary concerns about secrecy, morality, and institutional corruption. They became an enduring lens through which societies could explore the tension between obedience and autonomy, faith and pragmatism, visibility and concealment. The fascination with the Templars persisted into the modern period, aided by the gradual release of previously inaccessible records. The discovery of documents like the Chinon parchment illuminated aspects of their suppression, demonstrating that the Church itself had absolved the order of heresy while political expedience allowed their destruction. This revelation did not erase the Templars' mythic aura. Rather, it intensified it. Their story became a tale of moral compromise at the highest levels of authority, a story of truth and injustice intersecting in ways that resonate centuries later. Through all of this, the Templars' symbolic significance grew as a reflection of enduring human concerns. They represent the allure and danger of concentrated, disciplined power operating independently, the fragility of institutions that claim moral authority but act pragmatically, and the persistence of knowledge, skill, and identity even when official structures attempt to erase them. The Order's dissolution, far from closing the chapter, opened a narrative that continues to captivate scholars, storytellers, and the public imagination alike. Even today, the Templars are invoked in literature, film, and popular culture as emblems of hidden knowledge, secret networks, and the tension between spiritual fidelity and worldly authority. Their story provides a framework for exploring questions about the control of information, the interplay between obedience and conscience, and the ways that institutions respond when confronted with independent power. The enduring fascination reflects not only the drama of their downfall but the broader implications of their existence and destruction. Ultimately, the Knights Templar endure as an idea rather than an institution. They are a symbol of both possibility and peril, of disciplined effectiveness and vulnerability, of moral conviction and political expedience. Their influence persists in the systems, stories, and cultural memory of the societies they touched, reminding us that even when an organization is destroyed, the principles, methods, and legacy it embodied can continue to shape the world for centuries to come.